The woman who saves a kingdom rarely gets to keep her pride. She gets to keep her scars.
The terms you offer
Luna
are
Serena.
unacceptable.
Oh? What
Vale
gives you the
stood in
right
a
to
hall
refuse them?
full of
You
wolves
betray
who
us
had
all.
watched her bleed for their king, and not one of them moved when he handed her leash to a stranger. That's the thing about power. People don't follow the throne. They follow whoever looks like they'll survive. And tonight, in the kingdom of Varelis, every set of eyes in that room was about to learn that the most dangerous creature alive isn't the alpha who howls the loudest. It's the woman who's already decided she has nothing left to lose. Stay until the end. Like this, if you know someone who's been underestimated. And drop your city in the comments. I want to know where my people are watching from. The feast hall of Varelis hadn't changed in the 7 years Serena had stood inside it. The same vaulted ceiling of black stone, carved with the silhouettes of wolves mid-leap. The same iron chandeliers dripping candlelight across tables long enough to seat 100 nobles. The same smell, roasted venison, pine resin, the faint metallic edge of steel that clung to every surface in a king's hall, whether there was blood on the floor or not. Even the arrangement of the high table hadn't shifted. The Alpha King's chair at the center, flanked by his war council on the left, and on the right, the Luna's seat. Her seat. Serena stood in the antechamber just off the main entrance and listened to the sounds of 300 wolves settling in for the moon banquet. Laughter, the heavy thud of wine goblets hitting wood, a hound scratching somewhere near the back wall. Normal sounds. Familiar sounds. The sounds of a court that still believed tonight would be like every other night. She straightened the silver clasp at her shoulder. It held the Luna crest, a crescent wrapped in 2 wolf's paws, the symbol that had been pressed into her palm the morning after her bonding ceremony 6 years and 4 months ago. She remembered how Darius had looked at her then, not with softness. He wasn't a man built for softness, but with something that had felt close enough to respect that she'd mistaken it for the real thing. She hadn't been back in the hall for 6 days. The last time she'd been inside this room, she'd been standing at the war table with General Caro, reviewing supply chains for the northern border posts. That was before the riders arrived from the Ashcroft territories, before the king returned with mud on his boots and a woman Serena had never seen standing at his left side, close enough that their shoulders touched when he walked. 6 days. Long enough for half the court to believe whatever story had already started circulating. Long enough for Celine Ashcroft to be given a guest suite on the 2nd floor of the East Wing, 3 rooms down from Serena's own chambers. Long enough for Serena to lie awake in the dark on the 3rd night, staring at the ceiling, and understand with absolute clarity that whatever was happening wasn't a political arrangement. She'd smelled it on him when he passed her in the corridor. Not the woman's perfume. That was too easy, too obvious a thing to notice. No. What she'd caught was the specific quality of his silence, the way a wolf goes quiet, not when he's thinking, but when he's already decided and doesn't want to say it out loud yet. She'd known that silence for 6 years. She'd learned to read Darius Thorne the way you learn to read weather over the mountains. Not because the sky tells you plainly, but because you've survived enough storms to recognize the pressure change before the clouds even move. Mira appeared at her elbow. Her personal attendant had been with her since before the palace, a compact woman with iron-gray hair and the permanent expression of someone calculating the fastest exit from any room she entered. "They're seated," Mira said. Her voice stayed flat. "She's at the high table." Serena didn't ask which seat. "And the king?" "Arrived 20 minutes past. He didn't send for you." That was its own answer. Serena took a slow breath through her nose. The antechamber smelled like cold stone and someone spilled wine from earlier in the evening. She cataloged each part of herself the way she'd been taught to do before difficult things. Feet solid against the floor, shoulders back but not rigid, hands still, face arranged into the expression she'd spent years perfecting. Composed, present, impossible to read. "Then I'll go to my seat," she said. Mira touched her arm once, barely a brush. "Serena, don't. I'm not going to tell you to leave." "Good. I'm going to tell you that whatever's in that room tonight, you walk in knowing you're not surprised. Because surprised women get used. And you've never been one of those." Serena looked at her for a moment. Then she moved through the door. The hall noise dropped by half a beat when she entered. It was the kind of drop that tried to pass itself off as coincidence. A lull in conversation, a sudden interest in the food, the shuffle of a chair. But Serena had walked into enough charged rooms to know the difference between a natural pause and one that had been waiting for her. Every set of eyes in that room either moved to her or deliberately didn't, which was its own kind of watching. She kept her pace even, not slow enough to be cautious, not quick enough to be nervous. The path to the high table took her past the lesser nobility's seats, the younger houses, the border lords, the wolves whose titles were real, but whose influence lived and died on whichever direction the wind was blowing from the throne. She saw Lord Fenwick drop his eyes to his plate. Lady Caris offered a small nod, then seemed to think better of it and looked away. Two of the younger warriors from the 3rd Pack unit watched her with expressions she recognized as the particular blankness of men trying to decide what they were allowed to feel. And then she reached the high table. Darius sat at the center. He looked the way he always looked, like something carved from the same black stone as the walls, hard through the jaw and shoulders, the kind of big that didn't come from bulk but from density. He was wearing the dark charcoal ceremonial coat, the one he wore specifically for moon banquets, the silver threads at the collar catching the candlelight. His hands were on the table. Still. She knew those hands. He didn't look at her when she approached. The woman to his right was watching her, though. Celine Ashcroft was younger than Serena had expected. Not by much, maybe 2 or 3 years, which made it worse somehow. She was dark-haired, long-limbed, dressed in deep red with gold at her wrists, and she had the particular kind of beauty that knew exactly what it was doing. She was watching Serena with an expression that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite a challenge. Something between, something that said she'd already decided the outcome of this night. Serena pulled out her chair, sat, laid her hands in her lap. General Caro, to the king's left, gave her one brief look of something that might have been apology or might have been warning. She didn't have time to read it before Darius finally turned his head. Luna Serena. Not warm, not cold, the way you greet a soldier reporting for duty. My king. Her voice came out level. Good. I trust you've recovered from your absence. I wasn't ill. A pause. Something moved through the muscles along his jaw. No. I suppose you weren't. She picked up her goblet, took a measured sip. The wine was the same Varellus dark they used for all ceremonial nights. Thick, blood-warm, not unpleasant. Her hand was steady. Across the high table, she heard Celine say something quiet to the wolf seated beside her, and they both laughed, the sound low and confidential, meant to be heard without being responded to. A testing laugh, the kind used by people who are checking to see if anyone's paying attention. Serena did not look. The first hour passed in the mechanical rhythm of ceremony. Courses arrived. Toasts were made. Darius spoke to his war council. Celine spoke to the nobles nearest her with a fluency that told Serena she'd been well briefed on who in this room mattered and who didn't. She was working the table the way someone works a room they plan to own, not the way a guest navigates one. Serena noted that, filed it, kept eating. It was during the 3rd course that Darius set down his knife. The specific sound of it, deliberate, not dropped, was a kind of signal she'd learned to recognize. He made that sound when he was about to say something he'd already decided to say. Celine tells me she's unfamiliar with the moon banquet traditions, he said. He was addressing the table broadly, the way kings address rooms when they want it to sound casual and want the opposite. The significance of the serving ritual. The serving ritual. Serena held very still. The serving ritual was one of the older traditions, pre-war, pre-consolidation, dating back to when the moon banquet was a sacred ceremony held only for bonded pairs and their bloodlines. The Luna served the Alpha King the first cup and the first plate by hand as a symbol of the bond between them. It had shifted in the last 100 years. Less symbolism, more ceremony. But it was still the Luna's role, and everyone at this table knew it. Traditionally, Darius continued, the Luna presents the serving ritual to those the Alpha King has brought under his protection. The hall was very quiet now. Serena turned her head and looked at him directly for the first time all evening. His eyes met hers, brown and deep set and currently carrying the particular expression of a man who had talked himself into something. She'd seen that expression before, usually before a war decision she'd disagreed with, 1 or 2 times when he was about to say something irrevocable. I'd like you to extend that honor to Lady Celine, he said. Tonight. The words landed in the room the way a blade lands on a table. Clean, deliberate, impossible to pretend you didn't hear. Serena felt the exact quality of silence that followed. 300 wolves in a hall, and not one of them spoke. Not one chair scraped. Not one person reached for a goblet, or coughed, or found a reason to lean over and murmur to their neighbor. The whole room simply held itself, waiting, the way animals go still when something large moves nearby. She was being asked to kneel, not in those words. The words were dressed up in tradition and ceremony and the neutral language of a man who'd convinced himself this was a reasonable request. But that was what it was. She was being asked to take a plate of food from this table and carry it with her hands across the high table and set it before a woman who had arrived in this palace 6 days ago and whose name Serena still didn't fully know, and do it in front of every wolf lord and warrior and servant in Varelis, and do it as the Luna, which meant doing it as the symbolic embodiment of everything this kingdom was supposed to stand for. She was being asked to announce, with her own body, that she no longer mattered. The part of her that had survived 7 years at this man's side, the part that had learned patience the way you learn a language you hadn't wanted to study, told her to say yes. Not because it was right, but because saying yes tonight meant surviving to fight tomorrow, and surviving was arithmetic, and she'd always been better at arithmetic than most people expected. But there was another part of her. It had been growing for 6 days, fed by each silence and each passed-by corridor, and each morning she'd woken to the sound of laughter from Celine's rooms down the hall. Small things. The way a hairline fracture is small, until it isn't. She looked at Darius. She looked at him the way she'd looked at the northern mountains during the war. Carefully, completely, with no illusion about the scale of what she was facing. She saw the set of his jaw and the slight forward lean of his posture and the particular rigidity in his shoulders that meant he'd built a wall behind this decision and he wasn't going to come out from behind it tonight. And she thought, he actually believes this is acceptable, not cruelty, though it was, not a power play, though it was that too. He genuinely, in whatever version of this conversation he'd run in his own head, believed this was a reasonable thing to ask. That was the part that cracked something open. No, she said. Just the one word. Quietly. The way you close a door that's been left open too long. The silence changed quality. Before, it had been held breath. Now it was something heavier, something that pressed against the walls. Darius went very still. Serena. His voice had dropped. That register, low, slow, the edge underneath like a hand on a knife handle. She'd heard it in war councils and private fights, and once, years ago, when a border lord had tried to challenge his authority and left the room minus his composure and 2 teeth. You asked, she said. I'm answering. I'm not asking. You are, though. She kept her voice steady. You're the Alpha King. You have authority to command a great many things in this hall, but you can't command respect and you can't command the meaning of what you're asking. You know what this looks like. I know what defiance from my own Luna looks like, he said, and his voice now had that specific quality, the one that the whole court had spent years learning to fear, the one that preceded consequences. In my own hall, in front of my court. Then we're both learning something tonight, she said. The gasp that came from somewhere to her left was quiet. It was still the loudest thing in the room. Celine had gone very still, she noticed. Not the stillness of surprise, something more deliberate, calculating. She'd need to think about that later. Darius stood. He was a big man. Standing made it worse, or would have, for someone who hadn't spent 6 years measuring herself against that size. He put both hands flat on the table and looked at her the way she imagined he looked at things he was about to break. You will stand, he said, and you will serve. I will not, Serena said. She stood too. She was shorter. She'd always been shorter. She looked at him across 2 feet of candlelit table and held his gaze the way you hold a line you've decided not to give. And you should sit down. You're refusing a direct order from your Alpha King. I'm refusing to be humiliated in front of my people by the man I've stood beside through 2 wars and 3 assassination attempts, and a famine that would have broken this kingdom in half without the alliances I built while you were fighting in the north. Her voice didn't shake. She was almost surprised. I have never once refused you a reasonable thing. This isn't reasonable. This is my hall. It's also mine. The words hit the room. She watched them land on every face at the high table, the war council, the border lords, the servants along the wall. She watched them hit Celine, who didn't react at all, which was its own kind of answer. And she watched them hit Darius, who was, for possibly the first time since she'd known him, at a complete loss for what to do. You forget yourself, he said finally. No, she said. I think I'm just now remembering. She sat back down, picked up her goblet, took a slow, deliberate sip, and waited. The hall didn't breathe. What happened next was the thing she'd remember later. Not the words, because the words had already been said and were already flying through the court at the speed that words always travel when they carry enough weight to break something. What she remembered was the quality of the silence that followed, the way the entire room recalibrated, every wolf in it quietly and irrevocably updating their understanding of what she was. She was not the woman who had walked in tonight. She was not the same Luna who had stood at the bonding ceremony and said the words and accepted the crest. She was not the woman who'd been patient through 6 days of silence and closed doors and the sound of someone else's laughter from 3 rooms down the hall. She was something they hadn't made a word for yet. Darius sat down. Slowly. Not graciously. He was not a gracious man, had never pretended to be. He sat down the way a wall settles after the ground shifts beneath it, still standing, but changed at the foundation. He didn't speak. He picked up his knife and turned back to his plate, and the silence around the high table was the densest thing in the room. No one looked at Celine. That was interesting. The banquet continued the way a river continues after a stone's been thrown in, adjusted, unsettled, finding its way around the new shape of things. Conversation restarted in the lower tables first, cautious, people testing the sound of their own voices. By the time the 4th course arrived, the hall had recovered something close to its normal noise level, but it was a performance of normality. The kind of careful recreation that happens after something real, when everyone is trying to pretend they saw less than they saw. Serena ate, she spoke when spoken to. She answered General Caro's careful, neutral question about the Eastern grain reports with calm competence, because that was what she did, that was who she was. And she was not going to let one moment, even this one, turn her into someone smaller. But she felt it all, every slight shift in Darius's posture beside her. The rigid line of his shoulders, the particular way he held his jaw when he was working through something he hadn't finished with. He wasn't done. She'd known that the moment she'd sat back down. This wasn't over. Not tonight, and not tomorrow, and probably not for a long time. Kings didn't lose face at their own tables and simply move forward. Darius Thorne especially didn't. She'd known that going in. She'd said no anyway. Somewhere in the left side of her chest, under the silver clasp and the ceremonial coat and all the years of careful management, something very old was very slowly unclenching. It felt like exhaling after holding your breath for so long you'd forgotten what it cost. Late in the evening, after the formal toasts, after the ceremony, after most of the court had settled into the comfortable noise of wine and proximity, Mira appeared at her elbow again, moving with the practiced invisibility of a woman who'd spent decades learning how to be in rooms without being in rooms. You should know, Mira said quietly, close to her ear, that 3 wolves left the table within 10 minutes of what happened. Lord Heron of the Ashcroft-adjacent territories, Mistress Vane from the Trade Council, and a young man I don't know, dark coat, wolf mark on his left hand, who was seated at Celine's table. Serena absorbed that. Heron left early or left to communicate? The latter. He went to the East Wing, didn't come back. Serena looked down at her wine. Lord Heron of the Ashcroft-adjacent territories. Not a major house, but a connected one, tied by blood and trade to 6 smaller packs along the eastern border, packs that had been quietly absorbed into the trade network over the last 3 years, packs that reported supply needs through a secondary channel she'd always found slightly odd but never had cause to question directly. And he'd left her table tonight to go to the East Wing, where Celine Ashcroft had rooms. The young man, she said carefully, the one you didn't know. He spoke to no one at dinner except to Celine directly, very briefly, twice. The second time, she gave him something, folded paper, I think, or something small, passed under the table. Serena set down her goblet with the same deliberate quietness as Darius had set down his knife earlier in the evening. A small thing, a signal only she understood. "I want eyes on Heron," she said. "Not tonight. Tonight everyone will be watching everyone else. Tomorrow. Already planned. And find out who the young man is. I have a description. I'll know by morning." Serena looked out at the hall, at the moving tide of wolves and nobles and servants, the candlelight breaking across silver and steel, and the shifting fabric of court dress, the whole performance of a kingdom at peace with itself. She'd stood in this hall for 6 years. She'd learned its acoustics, its angles, which alcoves carried sound and which table position gave you the best view of the main doors. She'd studied it the way a soldier studies ground they might have to fight on, because that was how she'd always moved through the world, not with pessimism, but with the particular practical intelligence of someone who knew that rooms don't stay safe just because they're familiar. 6 days ago, she'd been blindsided. She was done being blindsided. 3 days after the moon banquet, the orders came. Serena was in her study, the one adjacent to her chambers, the narrow room with the north-facing window where the light came in gray and honest and didn't flatter anything, when the royal herald knocked. He was young, new, and couldn't quite meet her eyes. That told her something before he opened his mouth. The orders were read aloud in the formal voice used for official proclamations. The flat, careful tone that stripped all human inflection from the words and left only their edge. By directive of Alpha King Darius Thorne, the Luna Serena Vale was to be removed from her seat on the Royal Council effective the following morning. Her access to the war room, the treasury ledgers, and the diplomatic correspondence channels was suspended until further notice. She was to receive no official visitors in her chambers without prior approval from the king's secretary. The herald finished and waited. Serena looked at him. He was 20, maybe 22. Brand new to the palace, she could tell by the way he held his scroll too tightly. He had nothing to do with this. He was just the mechanism by which the message moved. "Thank you," she said. "You can go." He left with visible relief. She sat with the silence. It wasn't surprising. She'd known it was coming. The form of it, the scale of it, not the exact timing. She'd been stripped before. Not of her title, not this directly, but of pieces. The minor influence shaved away in the early years when Darius had still been establishing dominance patterns with his council, when the easiest thing to cut was the woman whose voice was newer. She'd rebuilt each time. Carefully, without drama, by being indispensable. But this was different. This was public. This was designed to be seen. She picked up the inkwell on her desk, a small clay thing, heavy for its size, and turned it in her hands, something to hold on to while she let herself feel the full shape of what was happening. She'd refused him in front of his court. Now he was rewriting the terms. The message was clear. "You have no power here. What you did didn't matter. I can erase you." She set the inkwell down. She picked up her pen. The first letter was to Lady Voss of House Merrick, an older woman, 40 years in the court, who had been passed over for her council seat twice in the last decade, and still came to every formal occasion with the patience of someone who'd learned to play a long game. They had a cordial relationship built on the careful ground of shared interest. Serena had helped broker the Merrick trade arrangement with the river territories 2 years back. Voss had a long memory. The second letter was to Captain Rhine, the senior officer of the 3rd Pack Unit. He'd been her grandfather's student once, had come up through the old wolf warrior tradition before the military structure modernized. Loyal, privately, to the values that tradition represented rather than to whatever title held the throne. He'd given her a look at the moon banquet that she'd categorized at the time as sympathy. On reflection, she thought it might have been something more active. The third letter she sat with longer. There was a name that had been living in the back of her mind since the conversation with Mira on the night of the banquet. Lord Aesel Vore of the Vore line, a house that had been deliberately marginalized by the current council 6 years ago, stripped of its military role in a political reconfiguration that had always felt slightly surgical. She'd questioned it at the time and been told it was a consolidation move, practical, nothing personal. Aesel Vore had gone to the outer territories and stayed there. He ran 3 settlement packs along the western ridge and hadn't been back to court since. Serena picked up her pen. She wrote his name at the top of a blank sheet. She didn't write a greeting or a preamble. She wrote instead, "I owe you a debt that your house was never paid. I'd like to begin settling it. Tell me what your people need." She folded it and sealed it herself. Outside her window, the palace went on. She could hear the activity. Movement in the courtyard below, voices of the guard shift, somewhere distantly the sound of a hammer at the smithy. Normal sounds, familiar sounds, the sounds of a world that hadn't yet caught up to the thing that had changed inside the woman sitting at the narrow desk with the gray northern light coming through the glass. They would, though. Everything catches up eventually. A week later, the first story reached her. Mira brought it in the way she brought most things, without comment, delivered like weather. Here's the shape of the air today. The story was this, that Celine Ashcroft had taken to holding informal court in the East Wing receiving room on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. Not official audiences. Nothing so formal. Just gatherings. Wine, conversation, an open door. Wolves who wanted to come could come. A surprising number were coming. Serena listened, asked 2 questions. Let Mira leave. Then she sat with it. An informal court. It was elegant, she had to admit. It didn't challenge anything directly. It didn't announce itself as competition. It was simply an open room and a welcoming face and the specific gravitational pull of a woman who was clearly operating from a position of royal favor, which meant that anyone who sat in her receiving room was making a statement about alignment without having to make that statement out loud. Smart. Too smart for someone who'd simply arrived on a king's arm. The second thing that reached her came from the young man Mira had identified. His name was Torrin Cass, minor family, newly arrived to court in the last month, officially attached to the Supply Assessment Division. No notable history, no powerful connections, except that his records showed he'd spent the previous 2 years in the Ashcroft territories, and that his appointment to the Supply Division had been signed off by Lord Heron. Serena stood at her north-facing window with that information and let it move through her the way cold water moves, informing everything it touched. This wasn't a woman brought back from the Northern Territories on a king's infatuation. This was a placement. The questions that had been living quietly in the back of her mind since the night of the banquet now stepped forward and made themselves very present. Who was Celine Ashcroft, actually? Not the story that traveled with her. Not the beauty and the easy charm and the red dress and the timing of a woman who'd appeared at exactly the moment the king was returning from contested territory. Who was she underneath the surface, the way all people are someone underneath the surface? And who had sent her? She needed access to the diplomatic correspondence channels, the ones she'd just been locked out of. She needed the war room ledgers that tracked the movements of key figures through official Varellis channels. She needed all the things she'd just been stripped of. She looked at her sealed letter to Asel Vor, still on her desk waiting for the next courier. She added a line at the bottom. It said, "I also need to know who's been moving through the Western Ridge territories in the last 6 months. Official travelers, unofficial ones, anything that felt wrong to you." She sealed it again. She was still staring at the window when the footsteps came. Not Mira's. Too heavy. 2 sets, the rhythm of guards, trained ones, moving with the specific cadence of an escort rather than a patrol. The knock at her door wasn't tentative. "The king requests your presence," said the voice on the other side. Serena closed her eyes for exactly 1 breath. Then she opened them, arranged her face, and turned to face the door. "Now?" she said. Immediately. She looked at the letters on her desk, at the window, at the single candle burning in the corner that she kept lit because the gray northern light wasn't enough, was never enough. She picked up the letter to Asel Vor and tucked it inside her coat. Then she went to the door. The walk to the king's private study took her through the East Wing corridor. She noticed and understood that she was supposed to notice that they were walking past the receiving room where Celine held her informal gatherings. The door was ajar. The room was quiet today, empty, but the scent of her perfume was still in the air, recent and deliberate and territorial in the way of a wolf who had marked a new space and was waiting to see who acknowledged it. Serena walked past without slowing. The king's private study was a room she knew the way she knew her own hands. Low ceiling, heavy bookshelves, a fire that burned regardless of the season because Darius ran cold in a way he'd never acknowledged as a vulnerability. The desk was large and dark and covered with the controlled chaos of a man who managed enormous things but had limited patience for systems. He was standing when she came in. Celine was there too. She stood to the right of the desk with her hands clasped in front of her, dressed simply today. Less red, a deep blue that made her look almost deliberately understated. She looked at Serena the way she'd looked at her across the high table at the moon banquet. That assessment, that particular quality of interest that didn't quite look like interest. Serena looked at her for exactly 1 second, then returned her eyes to Darius. "You asked for me," she said. "I did." He moved around the desk. He moved differently in private, less performance, more pressure. The King's Hall version of him was armor. This was something more like the actual weight. "I want to speak plainly. I've never asked you to be anything else." "Then hear this plainly. What you did at the banquet was a breach of ceremony, of rank, and of the basic expectation I have of my Luna in this court." He stopped 2 feet from her. "I gave you the opportunity to be gracious. You chose to be something else." "I chose to be honest." "You chose to humiliate me." The word humiliate landed between them, and she watched him feel the irony of it, watched it move through his face and not reach his mouth. "Darius," she said. She said his name, not his title, which was its own choice, and she saw it register. "I've been in your court for 6 years. I've been at your left side through things that would have broken half the wolves in this kingdom. You know what I am. You know how I work." She kept her voice flat, not angry. Anger would give him something to leverage. "What you asked me to do at that table wasn't a ceremony. It was a statement, and I didn't agree with the statement. You don't have the authority to disagree with the statement made by your king." "Then why are we here in private," she said, "instead of in the throne hall?" Silence. She watched him absorb that. The question had an answer, and they both knew it. Because what had happened at the moon banquet hadn't resolved the way it should have, and calling her before the full court would require him to formalize something he hadn't decided how to formalize yet. He wasn't here to issue another order. He was here to see if she would fold. "Darius," Celine said, and her voice was gentle, calibrated, the precise frequency of a woman who had learned how to introduce herself into a room without disrupting it. "Perhaps Serena simply needs time to understand the changes happening in the palace. It's natural to struggle with transition." The specific construction of that sentence, Serena, not Luna Serena, no title, and struggle, landed like a small blade, precisely placed. Serena looked at her. "You're speaking to me directly," she said. "I appreciate that." Celine smiled. It was a practice smile. Not quite warm, not quite cold. "I only meant, I know what you meant." She returned her eyes to Darius. "I'm not struggling. I'm adapting. There's a difference." She reached into her coat and removed the sealed letter to Vor. She held it for a moment, not showing it to him, not explaining it, just holding it, the way you hold something you need him to know you have. "I'm going to keep doing what I've done. I'm going to keep being useful to this kingdom. That's not a negotiation. It's not a request. It's just true." She tucked the letter away. "I should go," she said. "If that's all." Darius watched her. Something moved behind his eyes, not anger this time. Something more difficult than anger. Something that looked almost like the beginning of a question he hadn't let himself ask yet. "Serena," he said. She stopped, waited. But he didn't finish. She left. The corridor outside the study was empty. She walked it alone, back toward her chambers, past the east wing and the closed receiving room door and the fading scent of Celine Ashcroft's perfume, past the guards who tracked her movement with their eyes without quite looking at her, through the turns and thresholds of a palace she'd spent 6 years learning in the dark so she could move through it by feel if she had to. By the time she reached her own door, her hands had stopped being completely steady. She stood inside her chambers with her back to the door and breathed. Slowly. The way you breathe after a controlled fall, checking your body, accounting for damage, establishing what's intact and what isn't. She was intact. That was the only thing she knew for certain tonight. The letter to Assel Vor was still inside her coat. She took it out and set it on the desk and stood looking at it. She thought about Celine standing in the king's study with that practiced gentleness and the blue dress and the precision of someone who'd thought about this room before she stood in it. She thought about Lord Heron in the East Wing, about Torrin Cass in the Supply Division and the 2 years he'd spent in the Ashcroft territories, about the small folded paper passed under the table at the moon banquet. Pieces. She was looking at pieces. She picked up her pen and began to write something new. A third addendum to the letter, compressed and careful, asking for specific names connected to the Ashcroft trade routes in the last 18 months. She didn't explain why. She was halfway through when the door opened. Not knocked. Opened. She spun. Mira stood in the doorway, but her face was wrong, not the managed neutral of a woman delivering news. Something tighter, something stripped of performance. "Serena," she said, and her voice had dropped to the kind of quiet that meant the sound of it mattered. "I found the young man. Torrin Cass, Not Cass." Mira stepped inside and closed the door. The second contact, the one Heron met in the East Wing the night of the banquet. She glanced at the door, which was closed, then back. "He's not attached to any house. There's no official record of him anywhere in the palace registrations, but I found 3 wolves in the lower staff who recognized him." Serena waited. "He came to the palace twice before," Mira said. 6 years ago and 4 years ago, both times during the periods when the northern border disputes were at their worst. 6 years ago, 4 years ago. The border disputes. The supply route failures. The 2 moments in the last decade when Varellis had come closest to a coordinated internal rupture, when it had felt, briefly, like the kingdom might fracture along old fault lines. Serena's pen was still in her hand. "They gave him a name in the lower halls," Mira said. She paused. "They call him the Hollow Man." The candle on the desk snapped, wax falling. "Mira," Serena said carefully, "tell me everything. The Hollow Man." Mira said the name the way people say names that don't quite belong to the living, quietly, like the sound of it alone could pull something into the room. Serena set her pen down. "Start from the beginning," she said. Mira had 3 sources. 2 were lower staff, a kitchen runner and a laundry woman, both longtime palace workers, the kind who'd outlasted multiple court configurations and learned to survive by being invisible and remembering everything. The third was an older guard, retired now but still living in the staff quarters near the south wall, who'd been on overnight rotation during the border crisis 6 years ago. What they remembered wasn't a name, it was a presence. A man who arrived without fanfare, not through official channels, not logged in the visitor records, not accompanied by any house sigil or formal escort. He came through the secondary entrance near the East Wing, the one used for supply deliveries, and he met with people in the kinds of rooms that didn't have windows. The kitchen runner remembered him because he'd walked through the lower corridor twice in a single night, and both times the air had felt wrong, the way air feels in rooms where something bad already happened and hasn't finished happening yet. The retired guard remembered him because, during the first border crisis, 3 days before the key supply route failure, he'd seen this man in conversation with one of the senior logistics officers. He'd assumed it was official. He'd been wrong about a lot of things that year. "The logistics officer," Serena said. "Transferred out 6 months after the crisis," Mira said. "House Karen, minor family, went to the eastern settlements and didn't come back." And the second visit, 4 years ago, during the Vale River dispute. He was here for 2 days. The laundry woman saw him carrying documents, not rolled, flat-folded, the kind you fold when they're meant to be hidden in ordinary clothing. Serena stood up from her desk and moved to the window. The courtyard below was dark now, the torches making small pools of light that didn't reach the walls. She stood with her back to Mira and let the cold come through the glass and thought. 2 critical fracture points in the last 6 years. A man with no record who appeared at both of them. And now he was back, inside her palace, moving through the East Wing corridors at the invitation, or at least with the knowledge, of Lord Heron, who was connected by blood and trade to the Ashcroft territories. She needed to say it plainly to herself, the way you say a diagnosis plainly even when you don't want it to be true. Celine Ashcroft was not an accident. She was a mechanism. The question wasn't whether, the question was what exactly was being built and how far along the construction was. I need to know every name Heron has brought inside this palace in the last 3 months, she said. Not official visitors. Anyone. That will take time. I know. She turned around. Be careful how you ask. And Mira, don't write any of this down yet. Nothing on paper except what I hold myself. Mira looked at her steadily. You think it's further in than just Heron? I think a man who can walk into this palace twice in 6 years without appearing in a single official record has help from someone closer to the center than Lord Heron of a minor eastern house. The silence that settled between them had weight to it. Get some sleep, Serena said. Start tomorrow. Slow. After Mira left, Serena stood alone in her chambers for a long time. She didn't go to bed. She sat at her desk with the candle burning low and thought about Darius. Not the king, the man. The specific construction of him, the way he was built inside where nobody got to look directly. She'd been close enough for long enough that she'd mapped some of it, the underground architecture of his choices. He was not a stupid man. He was not even, in the ways that mattered for governance, a careless one. He was a man who had one consistent and critical failure. He trusted what he could see. Threat that came with a sword, he understood. Threat that came with a smile and a red dress and a deliberate softening of the air around it. That he had no instruments for. He'd brought something into this palace because he wanted to, and something had used that wanting. She blew out the candle and sat in the dark and felt the full ugliness of what that meant. Felt it completely, gave it its full weight, and then packed it down somewhere functional where it could inform her actions without flooding them. She'd learned that. You couldn't carry clean feelings and make clean decisions at the same time. You had to sort them. What she felt about Darius right now wasn't her business. What was in this palace was. The next 10 days moved in 2 registers simultaneously. On the surface, the court recalibrated around the new arrangement of power. Serena moved through it the way water moves through a changed terrain, adjusting without announcing the adjustment, finding the paths that were still open. She attended the sessions she was still permitted to attend. She spoke when spoken to. She was courteous to the nobles who were watching her with the cautious calculation of people deciding which side of a wall to stand on. She was not warm. She was not cold. She gave them nothing to quote and nothing to dismiss. Underneath, she was building. Lord Azelvor's reply came 8 days after she sent the letter. Short, direct. The handwriting was someone who hadn't spent time in court in years. No courtly flourishes. Letters that leaned slightly forward like a man in a hurry. It said, "You owe us more than a letter can carry. Send someone you trust and I'll talk." And yes, there have been travelers through the Western Ridge that I didn't like the look of. 3 times in the last 4 months, always moving east. She read it twice, then burned it. She sent Mira's most trusted contact west the following morning. Captain Reen responded in person, which she hadn't expected. He appeared at the entrance to her study on the 7th day without announcement, removed his officer's cap, and sat in the chair across from her desk with the deliberate physicality of a man who'd made a decision and was done reconsidering it. "You didn't write back," she said. "I don't write things like this down," he said. That was the beginning of a long conversation. Rin was 53, had been in service since before the current king's consolidation, and had watched the shifting geometry of power in Varellis with the particular clarity of someone who was never at the center of it, but had always been close enough to understand the mechanics. He'd seen 3 Lunas before Serena. He'd watched what happened to the ones who stopped being useful. "I need to know the composition of loyalty in the 3rd pack unit," Serena said. Direct, because Rin was a man who didn't respect preamble. "Most of it runs to me," he said. "Some of it runs to the crown generally. 3 or 4 wolves who've been moved into recent positions that I didn't request. Those I'm not sure about." "Moved in how recently?" 2 months. 3 months. He paused. "Around the time the king went north." There it was again. The same timeline. The northern trip. Celine's arrival. "Who approved those transfers?" "The order came through Heron's office, signed off by the secondary council. The king didn't see it directly. It's below the threshold for his personal sign-off. Supply routes. Transfer orders. A man with no record moving through secondary entrances. The architecture of it was becoming visible, piece by piece, the way a structure becomes visible when you stand far enough back to see the whole shape. "Rin," she said, "I need people I can trust in 3 specific places. The East Wing supply corridor, the secondary gate, and close to Heron without him knowing he's being watched. He didn't answer immediately. He sat with his hands on his knees and looked at her with the expression of a man calculating not risk, he'd already done that calculation, but commitment. The difference between people who watch and people who step forward. He'd been watching for a long time. "You're not asking me to move against the king," he said. "No. You're asking me to move to protect him," he said slowly, "from something he doesn't know is already inside the walls." "Yes." He picked up his cap, stood. "I'll need 2 days to arrange it quietly." "You have 2 days," she said. He left without ceremony, which was its own kind of answer. The confrontation, when it came, wasn't on her schedule. She was moving through the East Corridor on the 9th day, taking the long route back from the War Room archives, where she'd managed to access an older set of trade ledgers through a connection she hadn't had to burn yet, when she heard the voice. Not raised. That was the first thing. The voice was not raised, which made it worse. Celine was standing in the middle of the corridor with 2 of her attendants flanking her. She'd apparently just come from the receiving room. She had a cup in one hand and an expression of mild, pleasant patience that didn't match the way she'd positioned herself, directly in the center of the corridor, in the path that anyone moving from the archive toward the main hall would have to navigate around. Deliberate. Serena stopped. "Luna Serena," Celine said. The title, now. Not the dropped form she'd used in the king's study. The title used pointedly, like a thing picked up and shown. "I was hoping we might speak. Were you? I think we've gotten off to a difficult start." She tilted her head slightly. "That's natural. Change is difficult." "You've used that word before," Serena said. "Difficult. In front of the king. It's the honest word. Honest is interesting coming from you." Serena didn't move from her position. She stood exactly where she'd stopped, because moving would mean navigating around Celine, and she was done rerouting herself. "What is it you want to say?" Something shifted very slightly in Celine's expression. Not the smile. The smile stayed. The thing underneath the smile, the calculation that ran constantly just below the surface, recalibrated. "I want to tell you that I have no intention of being your enemy," Celine said. "You have a history here, a role. A place in this court that I respect. That's a very gracious thing to say. I mean it." "Then why," Serena said carefully, "is Torrin Cass in the supply division? Why was Lord Heron in the East Wing the night of the moon banquet? And why does a man your people call the Hollow Man have unrestricted access to the secondary gate of this palace?" The corridor went absolutely still. It was not the silence of the moon banquet hall, that had been 300 wolves holding their breath. This was 2 women and 2 attendants and a narrow stone passageway with nowhere to go, and the silence was a different kind of wait, more specific, the kind of quiet that happens when a move has been made that couldn't be taken back. Celine's smile didn't change, but her eyes did. "I don't know what you're referring to," she said. "Yes, you do." A pause. The attendants on either side of Celine hadn't moved, but their quality of stillness had changed. The specific readiness of people waiting for a signal. "You've been watching me," Celine said. Still mild, still pleasant. But something had dropped out of the performance, some layer, and what was underneath was colder and more precise. "That's a dangerous choice for someone in your current position." "My current position," Serena said, "is the Luna of Varelis. Stripped of my council seat, yes. My chamber access to correspondence, yes. But not of the title. Not yet." She let that land. "And the Luna of Varelis has a responsibility to this kingdom that doesn't end when the king stops looking." "The Luna of Varelis," Celine said softly, "serves at the pleasure of her Alpha King. You might want to remember that before you overextend yourself." "I remember everything," Serena said. "That's always been my problem." She walked forward. Celine didn't move. She held her ground in the center of the corridor. For 3 full seconds they were barely 2 feet apart, and Serena held her gaze without flinching, and she smelled it. Beneath the perfume and the deliberate warmth of a woman performing approachability, something sharper. The specific scent of a person running on adrenaline and discipline. Celine was not as calm as she looked. Serena moved past her. She walked the rest of the corridor without looking back and didn't allow herself to exhale until she'd turned the corner and the east wing was behind her. Her hands were not shaking. She noted that with something that wasn't quite satisfaction. She knew 3 things now that she hadn't known before. First, Celine knew she was being watched, which meant the network around her was better than Serena had estimated. It had either spotted Mira's inquiries or anticipated them. Second, she'd been rattled. Very slightly, very briefly, but the rattle had been real. The names, Cass, Heron, the Hollow Man, had landed on actual targets. She hadn't deflected with confusion. She'd deflected with threat. Third, the threat was specific. Your current position, not a general warning, a particular pressure point, which meant Celine knew the shape of Serena's vulnerability and was prepared to use it. Serena went straight to her study and wrote 3 more letters. The confrontation with Darius came 4 days later, and it was worse than the corridor. He called her to the throne hall, not the private study this time. The throne hall. The message was delivered by 2 guards at midday, in front of 3 servants and a junior council aide, which meant the content of it was already moving through the palace before she'd finished reading it. She arrived to find the hall arranged with the particular formality of a proceeding. Not a full court session. The galleries were empty, but the council was present, seated along the left wall, and Celine stood at the king's right side with a posture that said she'd been there long enough that it felt like her place. Darius was on his feet. "You've been conducting unauthorized investigations," he said. No preamble, no greeting. The voice he used in this room was different from the private one, wider, more deliberate, built for stone walls and carry. Serena walked to the center of the hall and stopped. "I've been asking questions. You've been directing members of the guard to surveil members of this court without my knowledge or authority." "Rin," she said. Not a question. Something moved through Darius's jaw. Confirmation. She thought Rin told him, or someone told him about Rin, and she thought it without anger because the arithmetic of that was its own information. Either Rin had second-guessed his commitment, possible, painful, or someone had been watching Rin watch Heron, which meant the network was closer to the guard than she'd thought. "You stripped my access to the council and the correspondence channels," she said. "You gave me no mechanism to fulfill the basic function of this role, so I used what I had. You used it to conduct a private intelligence operation inside my own palace. I used it to protect this kingdom." Her voice stayed level. She was aware of every set of eyes in that hall. The council members with their careful faces, the attendants along the walls, Celine with her hands folded and her expression of patient, sorrowful concern. "Darius, there are people inside these walls who should not be here. I've been trying to tell you. You've been trying to build a position," he said. "A network, allies, because you're afraid of what's changing." "I'm afraid," she said, "but not of what you think." "Serena." He moved down from the raised platform, and that motion, coming down to floor level, closing the distance, was the specific physical language of authority asserting itself in personal space. She held still. "This ends. Whatever you've started with Vor, with Rin, with whoever else you've been writing letters to, it ends now. You will cease communications outside the palace without my explicit approval. You will cease directing any member of the guard or staff without my explicit approval. And you will remember what your role is in this kingdom." The hall was very quiet. She looked at him. He was close now. 3 feet, maybe 4. Close enough that she could see the exact quality of his certainty, the way it was built, the specific material of it. He believed this. He believed he was managing something disordered, a wife who'd panicked in the face of change and was creating chaos to reclaim her footing. He didn't see what was behind him. She could tell him. She could lay out everything she had. The Hollow Man, the ledgers, the Western travelers Vor's people had tracked moving east, the transfer orders through Heron's office. She could put it all in front of him right now, in this hall, with the council watching. And Celine would deny it, and Heron would deny it, and there was not yet enough to prove any of it. And Darius, who trusted what he could see and had already decided what the shape of this situation was, would hear it as exactly what he'd expected. A desperate woman making accusations to justify her own defiance. She'd be finished. Not metaphorically. Finished. removed from the title, from the palace, from any position from which she could do anything at all. So she said nothing. She stood in front of Darius Thorne 3 feet away, in a throne hall with a council that was watching, and a woman who was not what she said she was, standing 12 feet to his right. And she made the calculation that survival required silence, that the move tonight was not to swing, but to stay standing, that she was not done, and she could not afford to look done. "Understood," she said. He watched her for a long moment, looking for something. The anger she wasn't showing, the argument she wasn't making. He'd expected a fight. She'd given him compliance, and he didn't quite trust the shape of it. "You may go," he said. She turned and walked to the hall doors. She didn't look at Celine, but in the 3 seconds it took her to cross the distance to the door, she heard it. A sound so small that no one in the hall would have caught it. A sound that required the specific hearing of a woman who had been training herself for weeks to listen to things that didn't announce themselves. It was barely a breath, the smallest exhale of satisfaction, from Celine's direction. Serena walked through the doors and kept walking and didn't stop until she was in the stairwell that connected the ground floor to the upper chambers, alone, the stone cold at her back, the sound of the hall still in her ears. She stood there and let it move through her, all of it, the things she hadn't let herself feel during the proceeding, the specific texture of being stripped one more layer down, being managed in front of witnesses, being told to stop doing the only thing she had any chance of doing. She let herself feel it for exactly the time it took to breathe in and breathe out. Then she straightened. Rin was compromised. She needed to know whether he'd been turned or simply watched. The difference mattered. She had Mira, and she had the contact she'd sent west to Vor. She had 3 letters not yet answered that were moving through channels Heron's network didn't know about. She had been told to stop. She thought about the Hollow Man moving through the secondary entrance with flat-folded documents in his clothing. She thought about the supply routes that had failed at the worst possible moments 6 years ago and 4 years ago. She thought about the eclipse ceremony coming in 34 days, the Grand Eclipse, the largest ceremonial gathering of wolf lords from across the kingdom, every major house represented, the royal feast, the crowded halls, the predictable choreography of a night that the entire court planned around for months in advance. She thought about what a person who'd been inside this palace twice during previous crises, who had unrestricted access to the secondary gate, who was currently moving freely through the East Wing at Heron's invitation, what that person might be working toward, and what 34 days was enough time to complete. She pushed off the wall. She was done being told to stop. She went to find Mira because there was still time, and she was not finished, and the thing that had been growing in her chest since the night of the moon banquet, since before that, if she was being fully honest, since the moment she'd understood that the silence coming off Darius in the corridor wasn't the silence of a man who'd made a political arrangement, but the silence of a man who'd made a choice and was waiting to see if she'd notice. That thing was not fear. It was the particular cold clarity of a woman who had decided that she would not be erased quietly. She was still in the stairwell when the sound reached her from the floor above. A door opening, footsteps, and then voices. One she recognized, one she didn't, moving through the upper corridor toward the East Wing with the quick, purposeful cadence of people who thought they were alone. She heard one phrase clearly, just 4 words, but enough. The voice belonged to Torrin Cass. He said, "Before the eclipse, everything." 4 words. Before the eclipse. Everything. Serena stood in the stairwell with Stone at her back and listened to Torrin Cass's footsteps fade down the upper corridor, and her mind did the thing it always did when a piece landed that changed the shape of everything else. It went very quiet. Not calm. Not peace. The specific stillness of a system running too fast to produce sound. 34 days. She'd been thinking about the Grand Eclipse as context, the crowded halls, the predictable choreography, the convergence of every major wolf lord under one roof. She hadn't finished the thought. She hadn't let herself follow it to its end, because following it to its end required accepting that whoever was behind this had been thinking about it far longer than she had. She followed it now. Every major house in Varelis, every Alpha Lord, every pack commander, every military officer above the 3rd rank, all present, all gathered, all consuming the same feast from the same royal kitchens, drinking from the same ceremonial wine stores, the king on the throne. The guard in their ceremonial formations, the ones that looked impressive and left specific corridors unwatched. The capital gates open for the influx of attending delegations. A night that the entire kingdom planned around for months in advance. A night that anyone who'd spent time inside this palace, who'd walked the corridors at midnight and mapped the sight lines and learned which guards went where during which ceremony, could plan around too. She moved, not fast. Fast in a corridor was a signal. She walked with the measured pace she'd spent 6 years perfecting, the pace that said belonging, that said purpose, that said nothing about the thing happening underneath her breastbone right now, which was the compressed, cold-burning sensation of a woman who had just understood that she was not ahead of this. She was not even level with it. She was behind, and the distance between her position and the thing she needed to stop was 34 days, and she did not have Run, and she did not have the council, and she did not have Darius. She had Mira. She had a contact riding toward Asilvor in the west. She had 3 unanswered letters. She had the names she'd assembled, Cass, Heron, the Hollow Man, and no official channel through which to move any of them. She had herself. It had been enough before. She told herself it had been enough before, and she almost believed it. Mira was in Serena's antechamber when she arrived, sitting in the low chair by the cold fireplace, with her hands folded and the expression of a woman who'd already been waiting long enough to know something was wrong. "How much do you know about the eclipse ceremony preparations?" Serena said. Mira's eyes sharpened. "The formal ones, or the ones that aren't formal?" "Both. The formal protocol is standard. I know it the way I know my own hands. The kitchens start preparation 3 weeks prior. The wine stores are unlocked from the secondary cellar 10 days before. Guard formations are set by the senior officer on duty, which, until recently, was Rin. Who replaced him on that roster?" A pause. "I'd need to check. Check tonight, quietly. And Mira, the secondary cellar. Who has access? Officially? The head steward, the king's chamberlain, and the senior guard officer on ceremonial duty." She paused. "And through Heron's secondary council office, there's a logistics approval chain that I haven't fully mapped yet." There it was, clean and terrible. "Map it," Serena said. "Everything. I don't care if you sleep." She spent the next 3 days moving with the careful efficiency of someone dismantling a clock in the dark, working by feel without being able to see the full mechanism, trusting that each piece she identified connected to the next. She couldn't use official channels. She couldn't go to the council. She couldn't go to Darius, who had told her to stop and who would not believe her without proof she didn't yet have. So she built the proof. Mira found the logistics chain on the second day. It ran through Heron's secondary council office the way Serena had suspected, a series of approval documents that looked individually like routine supply authorizations. Wine delivery schedules, kitchen staff clearances, ceremonial candle orders, each one mundane, each one signed off by a rotating cast of minor functionaries, none of them individually significant. Together, they were a map. Every document touched something that would be present at the Grand Eclipse feast. Every approval created a channel for something to arrive inside the palace through legitimate paperwork, inspected by people who'd been told what to look for and specifically not told what to look for beyond that. The system was designed to pass scrutiny because scrutiny was looking for a wolf with a weapon at the gate, not for a sequence of delivery manifests that collectively opened every door that needed to be opened. Serena sat with the copied documents Mira had brought her. Careful copies, hand-done, nothing traced through official records, and felt a particular cold admiration move through her before she pressed it down. This was not improvised. This was not a mistress with ambitions and a willing king. This had been planned across multiple years, tested during 2 previous crises, and it was currently running inside the machinery of this palace with the frictionless ease of something that had found its groove and was rolling. And she was one woman with an attendant and a network of people who hadn't yet committed to anything. The reply from Asilvor's territory came on the 4th day. Not from Vor himself, from her contact, writing back harder than expected, arriving with the specific urgency of someone who'd learned something they needed to put in a person's hands rather than in writing. The contact's name was Sarah. Young, quick, one of Mira's people. She arrived at the back entrance of the palace staff quarters at nightfall and was inside Serena's chamber within the hour. "He'll come," Sarah said. "Vor will come. He's been watching the Western Ridge travelers and he thinks he knows what the destination is. There's a staging point, an old supply outpost 2 days' ride east of his territory. His scouts have tracked 3 separate groups moving through it in the last 6 weeks. Staging for what? He thinks armed. He can't confirm numbers, but his scouts found equipment caches, stored, not in transit, like someone was pre-positioning. Pre-positioning. Equipment caches on a 2-day ride from the capital. 6 weeks of movement through a route that ran through the Western Ridge and emerged east of Vor's territory and aimed straight at Varelis. Eclipse night. Every gate open, every major house under one roof. The king on the throne, before the eclipse. Everything. She sat with it. She understood now, completely, finally, the shape of the whole thing. It wasn't just the feast. The feast was the interior mechanism. The exterior mechanism was an armed force that would arrive at the capital during or immediately after the ceremony, when the palace was already in chaos from whatever had been put into the wine stores or the food, when the guard formations were locked into ceremonial positions that left specific corridors dark, when every significant wolf lord in the kingdom was already inside the walls, effectively hostage to whoever controlled the gates. Take the feast, open the gates, walk in. It was elegant, it was patient. It had been built over 6 years with the steady confidence of people who believed they had enough time and enough cover to do it right. She had 26 days. She thought about going to Darius again. Ran the scenario in her mind with the dispassion of a person who'd learned to think clearly about things they desperately wanted to be different. She had the logistics chain, the copied documents. She had Vor's testimony about the Western Ridge. She had a series of connected names that, assembled, pointed in one direction. Against her, she had Celine, who was positioned at the king's right and had been building trust in this court for weeks. She had Heron, who had the credibility of a sitting council member and the documented loyalty that came with his eastern territories. She had a king who had already told her once, publicly, in the throne hall, in front of witnesses, that she was operating from fear and that she needed to stop. And she had the specific, irreversible fact that she'd been wrong once before. She'd built a picture, followed a thread, and the thread had led to Run, who had apparently said something to someone he shouldn't have, which meant either her construction of Rin's loyalty had been wrong, or there was a layer of the network she hadn't seen yet. If she went to Darius with what she had now and she was wrong, not about the overall shape, but about any single piece of it, she would be removed. The title gone, the palace gone, everything gone, and whatever was planned for Eclipse Night would proceed without anyone left to stop it. She could not afford to be wrong. She had 26 days to stop being wrong. The 11th day was when Mira came back with the thing that changed the texture of everything. She sat in the chair by the fireplace. The same chair, always the same chair, as if her body had claimed it through sheer accumulated hours, and her hands were in her lap instead of folded, which meant she was managing something. "I found who replaced Rin on the ceremonial guard roster," she said. "And his name is Darren Cole, 3rd rank officer, 4 years in the palace guard." She paused. "He transferred in from the Ashcroft territories 18 months ago." Serena looked at her. "His recommendation letter," Mira said, "was signed by Lord Heron." The room was very quiet. Serena thought about Rin, about the specific quality of his commitment when he'd sat across her desk, the weight of a man who'd decided, not the lightness of a man performing decision. She'd read that correctly. She still believed she'd read that correctly, which meant he hadn't told Darius about their conversation. Someone else had. Someone who'd been watching Rin long enough and closely enough to know he'd come to her. Someone who'd been inside the guard long enough to see the shape of a loyalty shift before it became useful. Darren Cole. Ashcroft territory. Heron's signature. And now Cole was managing the ceremonial guard formation for the grand eclipse. The architecture of it was complete. She could see all of it now. Every piece, every connection, every deliberately constructed overlap between the interior mechanisms and the exterior ones. She knew what it was, and she knew what night it was planned for, and she knew who was at the center of it. She just couldn't prove it to anyone who mattered yet. Mira, she said, how many of Rin's people actually know Cole is on the ceremonial roster? His 3 direct lieutenants, maybe 4 others. Can you get a message to his lieutenants? Without Cole knowing? Without anyone knowing. Mira looked at her for a long moment. It'll take a few days. You have 3. She had 23 days left. They passed in the particular way that time passes when you are doing many things very carefully and none of them fast enough. Serena moved through the court in the surface register, attending what she was permitted to attend, speaking when required, maintaining the exact profile of a woman who had absorbed her losses and was learning to exist within her new constraints. She watched Celine hold her Tuesday and Thursday gatherings. She watched the shift in certain faces at court, the slow, almost geological drift of loyalties that had been neutral moving toward the warmth of whoever currently had the king's favor. It was not personal. It was survival arithmetic. She understood it. She'd have understood it even if she weren't on the wrong side of it. She found Lord Fenwick on the 14th day. He was in the East Garden, a small man with a large title and the nervous disposition of someone who'd been making compromises for so long they'd become his native language. She'd never respected him. She didn't need to. She sat beside him on the stone bench without preamble and spoke quietly and told him exactly one thing, that the eclipse ceremony was a target, that the mechanism was already in motion, and that when it was over, every wolf lord who had done nothing would be remembered. He looked at her like she'd grown a second face. You have no authority to— No, she said. I don't. And you have no courage to act on what I've just told you. But you have ears, Lord Fenwick, and you've been in this court long enough to know that when a woman who's been stripped of her seat is still talking, it's because she knows something that hasn't become obvious yet. She stood. Think about what you'd lose if I'm right. She left him on the bench. She didn't know if it would matter. She needed seeds scattered in enough places that when things broke, she wouldn't be the only voice saying what she'd already seen coming. The night before the grand eclipse, Mira brought her the last piece. She came in late, past the second night watch, and the look on her face was different from anything Serena had seen from her in 6 years of hard situations. Not fear. Mira didn't frighten easily. This was something more specific. The look of a person who's confirmed the worst possible version of what they suspected. The wine cellar, Mira said. Serena went still. I got into the inventory records through the secondary kitchen access. 3 casks in the ceremonial stores have a different origin marker than the others. The manifest says they came in through the standard supplier, but the origin seal on the casks themselves doesn't match. It's a different press, Ashcroft Territory Press from the northern side. I don't know what's in them. She stopped. But the casks have been marked for the high table specifically, the Lord's cups, the King's cup, the King's cup. The room tilted. Not the whole feast. Not indiscriminate chaos first. The high table. Take the king. Take the wolf lords at the high table. The alpha commanders. The people whose removal would create immediate, irreversible power vacuum. Then open the gates. Then let the force in from the west, before the eclipse. Everything. How long ago were they placed? Serena said. Her voice came out flat and even, and she was distantly impressed by that. Within the last 2 days. The inventory was cleaned 6 days ago. I had a look then, though I didn't know what I was looking for yet. 2 days. While she'd been watching and building and trying to be careful enough and fast enough, and neither fast enough nor careful enough. Can you remove them? Not without someone noticing. The cellar has been locked under Cole's ceremonial guard protocol as of this morning. Standard pre-eclipse procedure. It'll look like standard procedure to anyone who looks at the record. Of course it would. Serena stood and moved to the window. The palace below was quiet. The particular quiet of a night before a major ceremony, everything buttoned down and prepared, the whole enormous machinery of a royal event coiled and ready. Somewhere in the East Wing, Celine Ashcroft was sleeping or not sleeping in rooms 3 doors from where Serena had spent 6 years of her life. Tomorrow night, the entire kingdom would be in this building, and she still couldn't prove it. She could go to Darius tonight. Right now. Wake him from his bed and put every piece of what she had in front of him and watch him decide. She ran that scenario again, updated for everything she now knew. The logistics chain, Vor's intelligence, Cole on the guard roster, the casks in the cellar with the wrong origin seal. It was more than she'd had 2 weeks ago, considerably more. But Celine had his ear, Heron had his council seat. Cole had the ceremonial guard under his formation tonight and would have it tomorrow. The moment she walked into Darius's chambers with this story, Celine would know within the hour. She'd proven already that she had eyes close enough to watch Rin. And if Celine knew, then whatever contingency existed for exactly this scenario would activate. If Darius believed her, they might be able to move fast enough. If he didn't, or if he delayed, or if he asked for the kind of verification that would take days they didn't have, then the contingency would activate, and Serena would be removed, and there would be no one left inside these walls who understood what was coming. She had to be certain. She turned from the window. "I need to get into that cellar," she said. "The guard rotation is Cole's people." "Not all of them. You said Rin's lieutenants. 3 of them still on the standard rotation. 2 now. 1 was reassigned this afternoon." Thin. It was very thin. "Which 2?" she said. Mira told her. Serena thought about what she was asking. Not from Mira, from herself. She thought about the 23 days she'd spent moving carefully, building slowly, planting things in people's minds and waiting for networks to respond, and being patient the way she'd been patient for years because patience was the only leverage she'd had. She thought about the night of the moon banquet, the way Darius had looked at her, the first man she'd trusted entirely, the man who'd given her a role and a crest and a place in a kingdom, and who had, in one night, handed all 3 of those things to a stranger and asked her to kneel. She thought about what was in those casks, about Darius sitting at the high table tomorrow evening, raising the ceremonial cup that the Luna had always served him, lifting it to his mouth because that was what you did at a feast, and there was no version of the man she knew that checked his own wine for poison on a night when everyone was watching. She thought about all of that, and she felt it move through her, the anger, the grief, the cold clarity. And she made the decision that had been building toward itself since the moment she'd said no at the moon banquet and set something irreversible in motion. She was done waiting for proof that someone else would accept. She was going to walk into that cellar herself. "Tell me which rotation window gives me the longest time between Cole's guards," she said. Mira looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then she told her. It was deep into the second watch when Serena moved through the lower corridor toward the secondary cellar entrance, dressed in plain dark clothing, moving with the particular practiced silence of a woman who'd learned this palace's acoustic geography over 6 years of living inside it. She reached the cellar door. The guard on the rotation was one of Rin's lieutenants, a woman named Tevra, broad-shouldered, steady-eyed, who looked at Serena in the low torchlight with an expression that said she'd been told something might happen tonight and had decided how she felt about it. She stepped aside without a word. Serena went through. The secondary cellar was cold and smelled of earth and old wood and the particular density of a space that hadn't been well aired in years. She moved through the rows of casks by the light of a small shielded lantern until she found the ceremonial stores, marked with the eclipse insignia on the endwood, set apart from the standard supply. The 3 casks were where Mira had said they'd be. She found the first one, ran her fingers over the origin seal. Wrong press, wrong grain, a stamp she didn't recognize from any of the official Varela suppliers. She pulled the small sealed kit she'd taken from the palace physician stores. Not stolen, borrowed, without explanation, because the physician had been treating her for a recurring winter cold, and she'd been in his workroom twice and had noted the location of everything. And she drew a small sample. She held the lantern close. She wasn't a physician. She wasn't a poison specialist. But she'd spent 6 years on a war council that had dealt with 2 assassination attempts, and she'd learned, specifically and practically, the things you learned in those situations. She knew what she was looking at. She stood in the cold cellar with the sample in her hands and felt the specific quality of being right about the worst possible thing. It wasn't enough to kill cleanly. It was enough to incapacitate, to drop the high table, the alpha lords, the king, into the specific vulnerable state where armed men coming through an unguarded gate would find no resistance at the center of power. Her hands were steady. She was very cold. She replaced the sample. She moved back through the casks, back toward the door, and she was 3 feet from the threshold when she heard the footsteps on the stairs above. Not the rotation. Too early. And more than one set. She killed the lantern. The door opened. Light came through. 2 torches, carried by 2 figures. She pressed herself against the cellar wall in the gap between two large storage racks and held completely still and breathed through her mouth and did not move. The first figure was Heron. The second was someone she hadn't seen before, tall, narrow, moving with the specific economy of a person who was accustomed to moving through spaces they didn't belong in. The Hollow Man. She understood it in the instant she saw him, the way you recognize a description made flesh. They stopped at the ceremonial casks. The Hollow Man checked each seal. Heron stood back and watched the door. "Still secure," the Hollow Man said. Voice like gravel. American flat. "Cole confirmed the rotation switch," Heron said. "The second watch is all hours from midnight." "Tevra?" A pause. Serena's chest compressed. "She'll be handled," Heron said. She closed her eyes for 1 second. When she opened them, she was already calculating exit. The door was 12 feet away with Heron standing 8 feet from it. The rack behind her extended 6 feet to the left and connected to the eastern storage wall. There was a service hatch in the eastern wall. She'd noted it on her way in, an old one, probably unused, but the hinges had looked recently oiled, which had struck her as odd at the time. She edged left, 1 inch at a time, slow enough that the shift of her weight against the stone floor made no sound. Heron said something to the Hollow Man she didn't catch, too low, facing away. The Hollow Man replied and she caught the tail of it. Tomorrow, before the 3rd hour. She reached the hatch, put her hand on it. The hinge moved in complete silence. Recently oiled was right, which meant this wasn't her hatch. This was theirs. This was a pre-prepared exit built into their own plan, and she was standing in it. She went through anyway. The passage on the other side was narrow and cold, and she moved through it blind, one hand on the wall, and when she emerged, it was into the far end of the secondary supply corridor, 50 feet from the cellar door, in the dark between 2 torches. She stood in the dark and breathed. Tevra was going to be handled. Between now and tomorrow night, a guard who had stepped aside for her was going to disappear from the rotation, and no one would notice until it was too late, and the cellar would be locked under Cole's people, and the casks would be carried up to the high table, and Darius would raise his cup. She had one night. She turned and moved for the upper corridor. And when she came around the corner at the base of the main stair, moving fast and focused and already rebuilding her plan in real time, she collided with the solid wall of a broad chest, and the hands that caught her arms were ones she knew by their grip before she could see his face. Darius. He was alone. No guards, which meant he'd come from the private passage behind the king's study, the one that connected to the lower floor without going through the main halls. He was still in formal clothing. He hadn't slept. He looked at her plain dark clothes, the extinguished lantern in her hand, the cellar direction she'd come from, and his face did something complicated that resolved, after a moment, into something she hadn't seen there in a very long time. "Tell me," he said. Not the throne hall voice, not the king's voice. The other one, the private register, the voice that had told her things in the dark in the early years when he'd still been learning how to carry what he carried. She looked at him. She had one night, and Tevra was going to be handled. And somewhere above them, Celine Ashcroft was 3 rooms down the hall with the Hollow Man's timeline running. And she had no proof in her hands, nothing on paper, nothing that would survive the morning intact. And Darius was standing in front of her in the dark, asking her to talk. She made a choice. "You need to listen to me," she said, "and you cannot ask me to stop halfway through." His jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. "All the way through," she said. "Darius, all the way through." A moment. "All right," he said. She started talking. She talked for 20 minutes. Darius listened. That was the thing she'd remember later. Not what she said, because she'd been rehearsing the shape of it for weeks in her own head, and the words came out with the flat efficiency of someone who'd stopped hoping to be believed and started simply reporting facts. What she'd remember was that he listened. No interruption, no crossed arms, no the expression he wore when he'd already decided and was waiting for the other person to finish. He stood in the dark of the lower corridor with the stone wall at his back and his hands at his sides, and he listened to all of it. When she finished, the silence lasted long enough that she counted her own heartbeats. "The cellar," he said. "Yes." "Tonight?" "Yes." He moved first. She followed. He didn't take the main stairs. He went back through the private passage behind the king's study, which connected through the lower floor and emerged 20 feet from the secondary cellar entrance. She'd known that passage existed. She'd never used it. It was the kind of thing you cataloged and didn't touch because it was his, and some spaces you left alone even when you knew them. Tonight, none of that mattered. The guard outside the cellar door was not Tevra, Cole's man. Serena recognized him from the guard rotation she'd memorized off Mira's notes. Younger, broad-faced, the particular stance of someone who'd been placed and knew it. He saw Darius and straightened. "My king." "Step aside." The guard hesitated for exactly 1 second. That second cost him. Darius moved past him with the specific authority of a man who had never in his life waited for permission to go where he intended, and Serena was through the door before the guard found his voice again. Inside, Darius moved straight to the ceremonial stores. She directed him to the 3 marked casks without touching them, pointing, keeping her hands back, because she needed him to see it without her fingerprints on the interpretation. He crouched beside the first one, examined the origin seal. His jaw tightened in the way it tightened when the thing he was looking at confirmed something he'd hoped it wouldn't. He didn't speak for a long time. She watched him process it. Watched the thing move through him, the specific seismic quality of a man who'd made a catastrophic miscalculation and was now standing inside the wreckage of it. He was not a man who fell apart. She'd always known that. But she'd also always known that the way he held himself together in those moments cost something real, and she watched it cost him now. The slight drop of his shoulders, the one long breath through his nose, the hands that pressed flat against his knees. "How long?" he said. "I think since before she arrived." Another silence. "I brought her in," he said. The words were flat. Not self-pity, self-accounting. The voice of a man who understood the arithmetic of his own mistake and wasn't going to dress it as anything else. "Yes." He stood, turned, and the look on his face in the low light of the cellar was something she'd never seen there before. Not anger, though the anger was there, a controlled burn running underneath everything. Something rawer than anger. The specific expression of a man who had been a fool in the precise way that the most capable people are fools, with confidence, completely, in the one direction he'd never thought to look. "Serena," he said, "don't." She didn't say it with heat, just quietly, the way you close something that doesn't need to be opened right now. "Not tonight. There's no time." He took that. Nodded once, the motion short and tight. "What do you need?" he said. "Rhine, now, tonight, not tomorrow. Done." Cole removed from the ceremonial guard roster before morning formation. "Done. The cellar locked under your direct seal, not the council logistics chain, and the 3 casks pulled and replaced before the feast staff begins preparation. I'll do it myself." "You can't do it yourself. The moment you disappear from the pre-eclipse appearances," someone tells Celine. He looked at her. "I'll handle the cellar," she said. "I need you visible. I need you in every place you're scheduled to be tomorrow until I tell you otherwise. Can you do that?" The question cost her something to ask. Not the logistics of it, but the shape of it. The strange reversal of standing in a cellar handing operational direction to the Alpha King of Varellis, like she was the senior officer and he was the one who needed placement. She watched him absorb it, watched him decide. "Yes," he said. "And Vor," she said, "his people are 2 days out. They need a clear signal to move now." "I'll send riders tonight." She nodded. There were more pieces, a dozen more threads to pull, a timeline to compress, people to move, and positions to fill, and they stood in that cellar for another 30 minutes and went through all of them with the cold efficiency of 2 people who had spent 6 years running a kingdom together and still knew how to work a problem even when they were bleeding. When they came back through the door, the guard who'd been standing there was gone. Serena noted it, said nothing. She went to find Mira. The rest of the night did not sleep. Mira moved through the staff quarters and pulled the threads that needed pulling. Rin appeared at the door of Serena's antechamber just before the 3rd watch ended. He'd been brought by a route that didn't pass the east wing, wearing plain clothes with the look of a man who'd been awake for hours already and had been expecting a summons. He sat down across from her and she told him what she needed and he looked at his hands for a moment and then said, "Cole's people are in 3 of the 6 ceremonial corridor posts. I can work around 2. The third one, the North Gallery post. That's the choke point. What do I need to do about the North Gallery post?" "Nothing," he said. "I'll handle it." "Rin, I need to know if handle it means what I think it means." He looked at her steadily. "It means remove him from the post cleanly and put my own person in before the morning formation. No blood." A pause. "Unless he makes it complicated." "Keep it clean," she said. "I know how to keep things clean." She believed him. By the time the palace began its pre-dawn preparations for the grand eclipse, the kitchen's lighting, the ceremony staff moving through their morning checklists, the particular organized noise of a royal household waking up around a major event, Serena had managed 3 hours of something that resembled sleep in the chair by the cold fireplace. She was awake when the first light came through the north window. She sat with it for a moment. Just a moment. The gray, honest light she'd looked at every morning for 6 years. The light that didn't flatter anything. The light that showed you things as they were rather than as you wanted them to be. She thought about what today was. Then she got up. The eclipse ceremony began at the 7th hour with the formal procession, every major house entering the throne hall in prescribed order, the Alpha Lords and their retinues filing through the great doors in the ranking sequence that had been the same for 100 years. Serena stood in her ceremonial position and watched them come in and checked faces and formations and the placement of bodies in the room with the systematic attention of someone who'd spent the night learning every post and position like a battle map. Rin's people were where they were supposed to be. She'd confirmed 3 of them by sight within the first 10 minutes. The North Gallery post was correct. Cole appeared twice, once during the early procession, once near the east entrance. And each time he was accompanied by at least 2 of his own, which told her he was running his own check and had noticed something in the morning formation that didn't match what he'd set up. He wasn't panicking, he was recalibrating. That was more dangerous than panic. Darius was exactly where he was supposed to be, standing at the front of the throne hall in full ceremonial dress, receiving the Wolf Lords as they entered, performing the role of Alpha King with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing it since his mid-20s. He looked the way he always looked in this hall, large and immovable and certain, the specific gravity of a man who'd held a kingdom together through 2 wars and understood instinctively that presence itself was a form of power. Nobody looking at him would know that anything was different. She'd always respected that about him. Even now, Celine was at his right. She was in deep gold tonight, the ceremonial color, chosen deliberately, the color of legitimate standing at formal court occasions. She was performing warmth and grace for the incoming lords with a fluency that Serena had to acknowledge was extraordinary. Every Wolf Lord who passed her received exactly the right register. Neither too warm for a guest, nor too distant for someone who'd clearly established herself in the king's trust. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. And she was watching the room. Serena had been watching her watch the room all morning. She was doing it in the way that people who've trained for surveillance do it, apparently present in her conversation, apparently engaged, but with the peripheral awareness running underneath, constantly updating, checking positions and faces and the small shifts in room composition that told you whether your plan was still intact. She looked, twice, toward the East Wing corridor. The third time she looked toward the North Gallery. The fourth time her eyes found Serena. They held for 3 seconds. Something moved through Celine's expression, very fast, very controlled. The specific recalibration of someone who'd just updated a significant assumption. She looked away first. Serena looked away too, and her heart was going hard and even in her chest, and she kept her face neutral and thought, she knows something shifted. She doesn't know how much. The feast began at the 9th hour. The high table seated 30. The Wolf Lords filled the hall, 320 wolves, the most significant gathering in the kingdom's calendar, the room loud with the noise of a court that had been building toward this night for months. Candles everywhere, the smell of roasted meat and warm bread and the specific layered scent of that many wolves in a closed space. Serena sat in her seat, the Luna's seat, the one to Darius's right that had been hers for 6 years, the one Celine had been positioned near since her arrival, the one that tonight Darius had, without announcement, without explanation, simply by standing at the door and directing the seating, given back to Serena. Celine was seated 4 positions down. The seating change had moved through the hall in the way all significant changes moved at court. Not with noise, but with the particular quality of attention that sharpens when something unexpected clarifies an uncertainty. People had looked. Some of them had understood what the look meant, some hadn't yet. Serena watched Celine process it from 4 seats down. She was still performing, still warm, still gracious, still engaged with the Lord to her left. But the calculation behind her eyes was running faster now. Something had changed. Multiple things had changed. And she was assembling the new shape of what she was working with. The cellar, maybe. Cole's report from the morning formation. The North Gallery post. All of it feeding into a revised picture, and the revised picture had a different timeline. Serena reached for her goblet, her own goblet, from her own table setting, the one that had nothing to do with the ceremonial stores, and brought it to her lips and watched Celine over the rim. The third course arrived. She felt it before she heard it. The specific shift in the room's vibration, the way a large space changes when something moves through it wrong. A sound from the direction of the main entrance. Not loud, but wrong in quality, wrong in timing, wrong in the way that every wolf in the room felt it in their instincts before their conscious mind caught up. A guard appeared at the side entrance, not the main ceremonial post, the secondary door, moving fast, moving wrong, and his face, when he reached Rin on the near wall, had the specific expression of someone delivering the news that the first wall had fallen. The western gate. She knew it before Rin turned and found her across the room. She knew it from the way the guard's hand moved when he spoke, a gesture that pointed east and low, the direction of the capital's outer perimeter. Not inside the walls yet, but at them, before the eclipse. Everything. They hadn't waited until the feast was finished. They'd moved early, 20 minutes early, before the high table ceremony, before the ceremonial cups had been poured. Someone had given them the signal that the internal plan had been compromised and the window was closing. Someone at this table. Serena's eyes went to Celine. Celine was looking at her hands. And then the sound came from the main entrance. Not the secondary door this time, the great doors themselves. And it was not the sound of a delegation arriving late. It was the sound of armed weight moving through a threshold that was supposed to be guarded by people who were no longer there. The hall noise dropped like a stone. Darius was on his feet before the echo finished. And then everything happened in the compressed, simultaneous way that violence always happens. Not sequential, not clean, but overlapping and loud and faster than the mind could fully track. The main doors burst open. Not enemy soldiers first. Those were coming. She could hear them in the outer corridor, the sound of boots on stone and steel finding its voice. What came first was the guard at the near post going down. Not by a blade, by something faster, something that dropped him before he could raise a sound. The wolf lords at the outer tables were on their feet. Shouts, chairs knocked back, the high table rising. Darius had his hand on the sword at his side and was already turning to assess the room, running the same geometry she was running. How many posts compromised, which doors still held, where the wolf lords were positioned relative to cover. Serena was moving, not toward the exit, toward Darius. She crossed the distance between her seat and his in 4 seconds and came in at his left side, and he registered her without taking his eyes off the main doors. "How many?" he said. "I don't know." "The western gate?" "Yes." "Cole?" "In the room somewhere. I haven't placed him." The first armed men came through the main entrance. Not many. 8, 10, moving in the specific tight formation of people who'd trained for this room, who knew its layout, who'd planned their entry points. They weren't in Ashcroft colors. They were in nothing. No house sigil, no territory mark, anonymous the way you are when you're meant to be difficult to attribute after the fact. Behind her, she heard the secondary doors open. More. From 2 directions now. Darius pulled his sword. The wolf lords closest to the high table had armed themselves, the alpha instinct, the immediate closing of ranks around the center. And she heard Run's voice somewhere in the middle of the room, cutting through the noise with the short, flat commands of a man directing a defensive formation. And she felt a cold surge of something that was almost relief because Rin was here and intact, and he'd placed his people right. "The North Gallery," she said to Darius, fast and close. "If they're trying to cut off the high table from the room, they go for the North Gallery stairs. It's the high ground. He heard her, turned and barked a name, one of his personal guards stationed at the hall's interior. North Gallery, hold it. The guard moved. She looked for Cole, found him at the east wall near the secondary entrance. He wasn't fighting. He was positioned at the door with two of his people, not as a combatant, but as a controller, managing something. The specific posture of a man who was running a door, deciding who went through it. She tracked the sight line from his position to where the secondary wave of attackers was pressing in, and she understood what he was doing. He was the valve. He was managing the inflow, controlling the pace of it, feeding armed bodies into the hall in a sequence that was designed to overwhelm the defensive formation without triggering the full Wolf Lord response all at once. She started toward him. She had no sword. She'd had no occasion to wear one to an eclipse ceremony and hadn't thought, no, she had thought, and had decided that arriving armed to a feast would signal exactly the kind of knowledge she couldn't afford to show publicly before she was ready. That decision was going to cost her in the next 60 seconds. She was halfway across the hall when she saw Celine move. Not toward the exit, not toward cover. She moved toward the high table, toward the abandoned ceremonial settings, toward the 3 goblets that had been poured from the standard wine stores at the start of the feast and set aside in the traditional preparation. Not the casks from the cellar. Those had been replaced, but there were 3 goblets already poured, sitting on the high table surface in the ceremony arrangement, and Celine's hand was reaching for the one in the center position. The king's cup. The casks had been replaced. The stores had been clean. But the ceremonial cups had been poured by the ceremony staff early in the morning, preparation from the standard supplies. And the standard supplies had had access from the logistics chain before Serena had replaced the cellar casks. And she hadn't thought far enough, hadn't thought all the way to the individual cups set out hours before the feast began, hadn't considered that a plan this thoroughly built would have a redundancy for exactly this contingency. She changed direction. She hit the edge of the high table at a run, and her hand closed around Celine's wrist a half second before Celine's fingers closed around the stem of the cup. The impact knocked them both sideways. Celine was stronger than she looked. Not the softness she performed, something harder underneath, trained. She turned inside the grip with the practiced economy of someone who'd learned to fight close and gave Serena her full weight in a shoulder drive that slammed them both back into the table's edge. Pain cracked through Serena's hip and lower back. She held the wrist. "Let go," Celine said. The warm voice was gone. What was underneath was cold and very precise. "It's already over." "No," Serena said through her teeth. "It isn't." She saw it then. Up close, 3 inches from her face. The thing she'd been assembling for weeks from the outside and was now looking at directly. The actual face of it. The real construction of who Celine Ashcroft was when the performance came off. Not evil, not the theatrical villain of a court story. Something more functional than that and more frightening for it. A professional. Someone who'd been given a job and had done it with total commitment and zero ambiguity about what she was and what she was for. She'd walked into this palace and she'd done exactly what she'd been sent to do, and she'd done it with a skill that Serena, even now, had to recognize. "You're good," Serena said. Her grip didn't loosen. Something in Celine's eyes shifted. Not surprise. Recalibration. "Better than you thought," she said. "But not better than me," Serena said. She pulled hard on the wrist, used the leverage of the table edge behind her, and turned them. Celine's shoulder came down against the table surface, and she tried to roll, and Serena drove her knee into the table and pinned the arm and used her free hand to knock the goblet sideways. It fell, spilled, the dark wine spreading across the white ceremony cloth in a stain that would be visible from across the hall. The cup was empty. She'd won that one. She had 3 seconds before Celine recovered leverage. She looked up. The hall was in full combat. Rin's people had formed a defensive perimeter around the Wolf Lords at the center. She could hear his voice over the noise, controlled, directing. The attackers from the main entrance had been met with more resistance than they had expected, and the initial push had stalled. That was Rin. That was the preparation she'd done. But the secondary entrance was still open, and Cole was still at the east wall. And at the edge of the secondary entrance, just coming through, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew he was arriving to a situation he controlled, was the Hollow Man. He stopped when he saw the hall. Something moved through his expression. very brief, a recalculation. The hall was not the configuration he'd planned for. The resistance was larger than expected, the high table standing, the wolf lords armed rather than incapacitated. His eyes found Serena. She was still holding Celine's wrist against the table. Serena's back was screaming from the impact. There was blood on her palm from somewhere. She didn't know when. Her hair had come loose and she couldn't see the left side of the room properly. She held the hollow man's gaze, and she saw it, the moment he decided to adapt, not retreat. Adapt. The plan's primary mechanism had failed, but a man who'd spent 6 years building this didn't have one mechanism. He had redundancies and alternatives and backup routes through the walls that she hadn't found yet, and he was recalculating right now, fast and cold, finding the next angle. He was going for Darius directly. She saw it in the direction his eyes moved. A single glance passed her toward the interior of the hall, where Darius was positioned, still holding, still coordinating the Wolf Lord's defense. She released Celine. She felt Celine shift behind her, the movement of a person freed. And she made the calculation in the half-second she had that Celine was not her primary threat in the next 90 seconds. The Hollow Man was. And she made the bet that turned out to be wrong. Celine's arm came around her throat from behind. Not a killing grip, a controlling one. Elbow under the jaw, weight leveraged, designed to drop someone to their knees rather than kill them because dead wasn't useful and compliant was. Serena felt her air constrict and dropped her chin fast and got 2 fingers under the arm before it could fully lock and pulled hard enough to create half an inch of space. Half an inch was enough. She drove her elbow back, used the table behind her as a brace, and put everything she had into it. The impact was solid. Celine's arm broke from her throat. She spun and put distance between them and faced her across 18 inches of spilled wine. Celine's face was bleeding from somewhere above the eye. She looked at Serena with the pure, undressed expression of a person who has stopped performing anything. "You have no idea what's still coming," she said. Behind Serena, from the direction of the main hall, she heard Darius shout. Not a command, something different, something that came out of the gut rather than the chest. The sound a man makes when something catches him wrong. And she turned without taking her eyes off Celine for as long as she dared and saw him. He was still standing, but there was a blade on the floor near his feet. Not his, a thrown blade, the kind you send ahead of a man. And the Hollow Man was cutting across the hall toward him, with 2 armed wolves moving at his flanks, pressing through the gap that had opened in Rin's perimeter near the north center, moving with the specific, efficient violence of people who'd trained for exactly this distance and this room layout. Rin was caught on the wrong side of a cluster of wolf lords. The personal guard was down. Darius had his sword up and his feet set, and he was absolutely going to be outnumbered in the next 4 seconds. Serena moved. She crossed the high table, not around it, over it, 1 foot on the surface and momentum carrying her forward. And she hit the hall floor and came up running, and she had no weapon and no plan beyond the one that had already made itself, because some situations reduce to a single possible truth. And the truth here was simple. She was closer than anyone else, and she was moving, and that was enough. She hit the nearest of the Hollow Man's flanking wolves shoulder first, at full sprint, and they went down together in a collision that knocked the breath completely out of her and probably cracked something in her shoulder, and she did not care. She was already moving, pushing up off the floor, because the second flanking wolf was still between her and Darius, and the Hollow Man was still coming forward, and she had maybe 2 seconds left. She got her feet under her. She found, on the floor beside the downed wolf, a short blade. Dropped in the fall, not hers, she'd take it anyway, and she closed her hand around the grip and came upright and turned. The Hollow Man stopped, 4 feet between them. He looked at her. At the blade in her hand, at the way she was standing, at the specific quality of a woman who had run across a table and driven herself through a trained fighter at full sprint and was still on her feet. Something moved through his expression. Not fear. Something more unexpected than fear. Respect. "Move," she said. "You're one person," he said. "I know," she said. "Move." He didn't. Behind her, the hall was still in motion. The sounds of combat, Rin's voice, the wolf lords who were fighting back now, the perimeter that was holding in pieces. She could feel the shape of the room shifting. The initial advantage of surprise had been burned, the defense was firming up, but it wasn't over and the gates were still compromised and Vor's people were still 2 days out, and there were still armed wolves coming through the secondary entrance, and the Hollow Man was 4 feet from her, and Darius was 3 feet behind her, and she was between all of it. She thought, this is the thing you become when you've burned everything that wasn't real. Not brave, not reckless, just stripped down to the one thing you wouldn't trade and standing in front of it. Last time, she said. The Hollow Man moved his blade hand, and from behind her, Darius's voice, close, very close, just over her left shoulder, said, "Don't." Not to her, to him. And for one compressed, suspended second, the 3 of them held that triangle. Serena with the short blade, the Hollow Man recalculating, Darius at her back with his sword coming level, and the hall noise was still everywhere, and the night was still happening all around them, and something in the balance of the room had shifted in a way that hadn't finished being determined. The Hollow Man looked at Serena, then he looked past her at Darius. Then his eyes dropped, just for a moment, just the briefest flicker, to the Luna crest at Serena's shoulder. The silver clasp she still wore because she'd never taken it off, because no one had managed to make her, because there were things you held on to not from sentiment, but from the specific stubbornness of knowing what you've earned. He made a decision. She saw it coming half a second before he moved, and she threw the blade. The blade caught him in the shoulder. Not the throat, not the chest. She'd aimed for the shoulder because she needed him alive, and she'd made that decision in the half second between seeing his body shift and releasing the throw, and the decision was right or it was wrong, but it was made and it landed, and the Hollow Man went sideways with a sound that was more surprise than pain, the specific sound of someone who'd calculated every variable in the room except the one that threw the knife. He didn't go down. He caught himself on one knee, hand pressed to the wound, and looked up at her with that expression still on his face, the recalibrated one, the one that had stopped performing anything. Behind him, his 2 remaining flanking wolves hesitated for exactly the half second that Darius needed. Darius didn't waste it. He moved past her left side with the specific economy of a man who'd been fighting since his early 20s and knew exactly how much force a particular distance required. 2 exchanges. She heard them more than saw them, the flat crack of steel on steel, and then the heavier sound of a body hitting stone. The second wolf was down before she'd finished processing the first. The Hollow Man tried to stand. Reen came through the gap in the perimeter from the far side of the hall at a dead run and hit him low, and they went over together, and Reen came up with the Hollow Man's wrist locked behind his back and one knee on the back of his neck, and the expression of a man who had been waiting for this specific moment for longer than tonight. "Stay," Reen said. He stayed. The hall noise was still going. The combat at the secondary entrance, the wolf lords in their defensive cluster, the sounds of the outer perimeter that Serena couldn't fully read from inside the room. But the center had held. The high table stood. The Hollow Man was on the floor with Rin on top of him, and both of Darius's personal flanking wolves were down, and Darius was still standing with blood on his sword arm, and his chest heaving and his eyes already scanning the room for the next threat. Serena turned to find Celine. She was gone. The space behind the high table where she'd been standing was empty. The spilled wine had already gone dark on the white cloth, the toppled goblet lying on its side. Gone. Not toward the main entrance, not toward the secondary, somewhere in the first seconds of chaos while Serena had been crossing the hall. She'd had a route. Of course she'd had a route. Serena looked at the secondary entrance. Cole was gone too. She turned to the nearest of Rin's people, a young wolf, mid-20s, who had the specific alert stillness of someone running on adrenaline and training. "The East Wing," she said. "Every exit from the East Wing. Close them now." He moved. She turned back to the hall. What happened next took the better part of 2 hours, and was not clean, and was not simple, and contained none of the resolution that stories tend to impose on the aftermath of violence. Because real aftermath is logistics and pain and the specific exhaustion of people who've been holding themselves together through a crisis and now have to stay held together while they deal with what the crisis left behind. The force at the western gate was not as large as she'd feared. Vor's people, it turned out, had not needed 2 more days. They'd been 1 day out when Darius's riders reached them, and Vor had moved his people through the night at a pace that his scouts' horses were going to feel for a week. They arrived at the outer perimeter in the second hour, and the force at the western gate, pre-positioned but undermanned, because the internal plan had been expected to do most of the work before they had to do theirs, took one look at the numbers coming over the western ridge and made the arithmetic decision that armies make when the math doesn't favor them. They broke. Not fully. There was a short, ugly engagement at the gate itself that cost 2 of Vor's people and 1 of the perimeter guard. But they broke. And the ones who ran east toward the Ashcroft territories, which told Serena something about where the center of this had been all along. By the time the third hour came and went, the palace was secured. Cole was found in the servant passage beneath the east wing, trying to reach the secondary exit, the same one Serena had used coming out of the cellar. Rin's person at the east wing exit was already there. He was taken without a fight, which told Serena that Cole had made his own arithmetic calculation and decided that whatever came next was survivable. She wasn't certain he was right. Celine was not found that night. She'd gone through a route that nobody had covered because nobody had known it existed, a passage in the lower east wing that connected, through a series of storage rooms, to the outer wall's maintenance walk, and from there to a drop point at the base of the north-facing exterior wall. Someone had prepared it. The drop point had a rope already installed, recently placed, the end coiled against the wall like it had been waiting. She'd planned her exit the way she'd planned everything else, long in advance, with redundancy, with the confidence of someone who understood that the plan might fail and had arranged not to be inside the failure when it happened. Serena stood at the rope and looked at the ground below the wall and the dark open territory beyond the capital's outer edge, and she felt the full complicated weight of that. The mixture of fury and grudging recognition and the exhaustion of a woman who'd been running on 3 hours of sleep and a cracked shoulder and the compressed adrenaline of a night that had tried very hard to break everything. She'd have to be found, eventually. These things had conclusions, but not tonight. Tonight, Serena turned away from the rope and walked back through the palace. The hall was in the slow process of becoming itself again. The Wolf Lords, some shaken, some rattled, some with the heightened electric quality of men who'd wanted a fight and gotten one, were gathered in clusters, the older ones already thinking about implications, and the younger ones still burning off the night's energy. The wounded had been moved. The dead, 3 from Ryan's unit and 2 from the Wolf Lord retinues, had been laid out in the side room with the particular dignified care that soldiers gave their own. Serena walked through the room and looked at every face and cataloged every shift in posture and expression, because she was still doing that, still running the assessment, still building the map, even though the acute phase was over, because that was who she was, and she didn't know how to be otherwise. She found Darius at the north end of the hall, near the gallery stairs, alone in the way that men in positions of absolute authority are always alone, surrounded by people who needed things from him and unable to say what he needed himself. His sword arm had been wrapped. The binding was clean but rough, done quickly, the sleeve cut above it. He was standing with his back to the room, looking at the wall. She stopped beside him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The hall noise continued around them. Conversations, movement, the specific organized noise of aftermath. But the 2 feet between them had their own quality of silence, the kind that builds over years and contains everything that wasn't said in all of them. Vor's people held the gate, she said. I know. A pause. I sent a message thanking him. He'll want more than a message. I know that too. He turned his head and looked at her. Not the throne hall look, not the private study look. Something else. The look that existed underneath both of those, the one she'd seen very rarely and only in the worst moments. The one that was simply his face without any layer of king or alpha on it. You're hurt. My shoulder. It's not bad. Your hand. She looked down. The blood on her palm had dried dark. She didn't remember when. Also not bad. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at the wall. I was wrong, he said. The words came out with the flatness of a man who'd said them in his own head many times already tonight, and was now saying them out loud, which for Darius Thorne was its own significant act. Not just about Celine, about what I asked you to do. At the banquet. What I was asking. She looked at the wall, too. I knew you were trying to tell me something, he said. I knew it before the throne hall. I knew it the night I brought her back and I walked past you in the corridor and you looked at me the way you look at things you've already figured out but aren't going to say yet." He paused. "I let myself not know it." "Why?" she said. A long pause. "Because knowing it meant looking at what I'd done," he said, "and I didn't want to look." The hall moved around them. Someone crossed nearby and gave them both a wide berth, sensing something in the air that wasn't meant to be interrupted. "I'm not asking you to come back," he said, "to the position, to the arrangement. I'm not asking you for anything tonight. I'm telling you what I should have told you in that stairwell 3 weeks ago and didn't because I was still trying to manage the optics of it." He turned toward her again. "You saved my life. You saved this kingdom. And before all of that, you told me the truth for 6 years, and I used it when it was useful and discarded it when it wasn't, and I called that partnership." Serena looked at him. She thought about the night in the corridor when she'd smelled the quality of his silence and understood what it meant. She thought about the moon banquet and the sound of 300 wolves not breathing and the single word she'd said and what it had started. She thought about 23 nights of building something out of nothing, of writing letters by gray morning light, of standing in a cellar with a lantern and a sample kit and the specific cold of being right about the worst possible thing. She thought about what it had cost. "I know," she said. "Serena, I know Darius. Not hard, not dismissive, just honest, the way she'd always been honest with him, even when he hadn't wanted it. I hear you. I believe you." She looked at the wall, at the carved silhouettes of wolves mid-leap that she'd looked at for 6 years from every angle in this room. "That doesn't mean I know what comes next." He nodded. Slow. The nod of a man who'd expected a different answer and was making himself accept the one he got. "All right," he said. They stood there a moment longer. Then the hall needed him. A lord approached with the expression of someone who'd been waiting for a gap. And Darius turned to meet it, and the moment closed behind him like water. Serena found Aesel Vor near the east entrance. He was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said precisely what she'd expected. A man in his mid-40s, compact, weathered in the specific way that people who spend years outside in difficult country get weathered. Not roughened, but clarified, the unnecessary parts worn away. He had the eyes of someone who'd been watching the Capitol from a distance for a long time and had developed strong opinions about what he saw. He looked at her with an expression that was direct without being aggressive. "Lord Vor," she said. "Luna Serena." He paused. "Or is it still Luna? I wasn't sure given the circumstances." "I haven't taken it off," she said. He glanced at the silver clasp at her shoulder. Something moved through his expression. Not approval exactly, something more considered. Recognition, maybe. "You fought tonight," he said. "Poorly. I lost 2 weapons and ran across a table." "You're still standing. So are you." He looked at her steadily. "Your letter said you wanted to settle a debt." "Yes." "The debt is real," he said. "My house lost something significant in the restructuring. People, not just position. Families that scattered. Wolves who stopped believing the Capitol had anything to offer them worth trusting." "I know," she said. "I've been in your territories in memory, if not in person. I know what the Western Ridge settlements look like. I know what's been asked of those packs and what they've been given in return." "Not much," he said. "Not enough," she agreed. "That changes, if you're willing to work toward it." He looked at her for a long moment. The kind of look that takes the measure of a person not by what they've claimed, but by what they've done and what condition they're in after doing it. She was standing in front of him with dried blood on her hand and a bound shoulder and the specific frayed quality of someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks, and she was meeting his assessment without flinching. "I'm willing," he said. That was the beginning of something. The aftermath took months, the way real aftermath always does. Not the dramatic clean break of a story's ending, but the slow grinding work of reconstruction, which is less interesting and more important than anything that came before it. Heron was tried before the full council. The evidence Serena had assembled, the logistics chain, the copied documents, Mira's testimony, the origin seals on the casks, Cole's eventual cooperation in exchange for the specific leniency that men in Cole's position often cooperate in exchange for, built a case that didn't require embellishment. He was stripped of his council seat and his eastern territories and given the choice of permanent exile or the consequences that Varellus law prescribed for conspiracy against the crown. He chose exile. The Hollow Man was held for 2 months while the council built the full picture of the network, the threads that ran back through the Ashcroft territories and further into the complicated political architecture of the kingdoms that bordered Varellus to the north and east, the ones that had been watching the consolidation of the last decade with the attentive wariness of neighbors who understood that a weakened kingdom was an opportunity. He was not in the end the origin of the conspiracy. He was its instrument, precise, capable, and ultimately disposable to the people who'd built him. He was exiled too. Serena pushed for it over the voices on the council that wanted something harsher, not out of mercy. She didn't feel mercy toward the Hollow Man, didn't feel much of anything toward him except a cold professional recognition, but out of the practical understanding that useful information had come from him and might continue to come from him, and dead instruments told you nothing. Darius accepted her reasoning. He accepted more of her reasoning in the months after the eclipse than he had in the 6 years before it, which was its own kind of reckoning that she watched him work through without helping him with, because that was not her work to do. Cole was kept in the capital under restriction, his movements monitored, his previous access permanently revoked. He proved useful in the reconstruction of the guard formation and the identification of every appointment Heron had influenced through the logistics chain, which turned out to be more than Serena had estimated and less than she'd feared. Celine was found 4 months later, not in the Ashcroft territories. She was smarter than that. She was in the borderlands 2 kingdoms north, living under a different name, performing a different version of the same essential function she'd always performed, presenting herself as exactly what a particular situation required and waiting for it to become useful. The messenger Serena sent was Mira. She went alone, which took a specific kind of nerve that Serena had always known Mira had, but had never had occasion to see demonstrated quite so directly. She found Celine and sat across from her and told her, clearly, without heat, in the specific tone of a woman delivering terms rather than threats, that the kingdom of Varellus knew precisely where she was, and precisely who she was, and precisely who had sent her, and that the choice in front of her was a permanent and genuinely clean exile in exchange for full cooperation, or something considerably less comfortable. Celine cooperated. What she told Mira took 3 days to record and added significantly to the picture of the northern political architecture, enough that Darius used it in the diplomatic negotiations that followed over the next year. The kingdoms that had funded the conspiracy didn't admit to having done so. They never do. But the negotiations proceeded from a position of Varellus's knowledge rather than ignorance, which changed the terms considerably. Serena was in the room for those negotiations, not as Luna, technically. The title had not been formally reinstated, she hadn't asked for it, and Darius hadn't offered it without being asked, which she respected. What she had was something less easily named, but more functionally significant, a seat at the table that nobody questioned and everyone understood. She spoke when she had something to say. She listened when she didn't. She watched the room the way she always watched rooms, cataloging and assessing, building the map. The Wolf Lords from the Eclipse Night, the ones who'd been in the hall, who'd seen what she'd done, treated her with the particular deference that survivors extend to people who kept them alive. It was not the deference of a Luna, the role-based respect that she'd spent 6 years earning and had it stripped in a single night. It was something more durable than that, the kind of regard you couldn't remove with an order because it hadn't been given by one. She thought about that sometimes, about the specific irony that losing everything she'd been given had forced her to find out what she actually had. She thought about the night of the moon banquet, the single word she'd said, the quality of the silence afterward, the feeling of something very old unclenching in her chest. She understood now what that had been. Not courage, not defiance, simply the moment she'd stopped performing a version of herself she'd outgrown, and had nothing left to lose by letting drop. The hardest work wasn't the conspiracy. It was what came after. It was the long season of sitting with what the conspiracy had required her to look at. Not Celine, not the Hollow Man, not the network of interests that had tried to use this kingdom as a mechanism. What it required her to look at was herself. The version of herself that had swallowed 6 years of careful management and called it patience. The version that had watched Darius make decisions she disagreed with and chosen her position over her voice and told herself that was strategy. It was strategy. It was also a small daily erosion of the things she'd most needed to protect. She thought about Mira in the chair by the fireplace saying, "Surprised women get used. And you've never been one of those." She thought, "I was, though, for a long time. Just not about the things I was watching for." She didn't say any of this to Darius, not directly. What she said, in the council chamber, 3 months after the eclipse, during the session where the question of the Luna's role was formally being discussed for the first time, was this. "The title means something," she said. "Not to me. To this kingdom. It means there is a voice at the center of power that answers to the people rather than to whoever currently occupies the throne." She looked at Darius. He was listening. He'd become much better at listening, in the way that catastrophic mistakes sometimes make people better at the thing they most needed to learn. "If you want to reinstate it, I'll carry it. But I'll carry it the way it was supposed to be carried. Not as an accessory to the king's authority, as an independent function." The council chamber was quiet. Darius looked at her for a long moment. "What does that look like?" he said. "It looks like a seat on this council that can't be stripped by royal order. A role in diplomatic correspondence that requires my signature alongside the king's for any agreement affecting pact territories, and a direct line to the outer territories, to the pacts that this council doesn't hear from unless something's already on fire." "You're describing a co-governance structure," Lord Fenwick said. He'd been one of the ones who'd come to her afterward, nervous, full of the specific apology of a man who knows he was on the wrong side of something through pure timidity. She hadn't needed his apology. She'd needed his vote. "I'm describing what this kingdom should have been built around from the beginning," she said. "Strength isn't enough. You can't run a kingdom on force alone. You need intelligence and connection and the kind of trust that has to be earned rather than commanded." She paused. 6 years ago I knew this. I just didn't say it clearly enough." The vote passed. Not unanimously. 3 council members abstained and 1 voted against, and she noted all 4 of them and understood that the work wasn't finished and would never be finished, that this was the nature of governing, not a solved problem, but a continuously managed one, a thing you had to show up for every day, with your eyes open and your hands available, and the willingness to say the hard thing when the hard thing needed saying. She accepted the Luna crest from the Council Herald on a Thursday morning in the 2nd month of the new year. No ceremony, no hall full of watching wolves, just the small room off the council chamber, Mira at the door, Darius standing 4 feet away with his hands at his sides, and the specific look of a man who had learned something irreversible and was living inside the knowledge of it. She pinned the clasp herself, the silver crescent and the 2 wolves' paws, the same as it had always been. She'd never taken it off, technically. She'd worn it through all of it, through the moon banquet and the stripped council seat and the cellar and the eclipse night and the months of reconstruction. It had sat at her shoulder through every version of herself she'd been forced to become. It felt different now. Not heavier, not lighter, just honest, in a way it hadn't been before, like a thing that had been earned rather than given, which maybe it always should have been. Darius watched her. "Serena," he said. "Not yet," she said. Not sharp, just quiet, the same way she'd said don't in the throne hall months ago. "There are still things between us that need time." "I know." "Good." She looked at him, at the specific construction of him, the man she'd spent 6 years learning and had never quite finished understanding and would probably continue not fully understanding for the rest of her life, which was its own complicated truth about people and the limits of even the closest knowledge. He was not simple. He had never been simple. He was capable of the worst kind of certainty, the kind that makes a brilliant and powerful person blind in exactly the direction they most need to see. And he was capable. She'd learned this, slowly, painfully, through evidence she'd had to trust rather than merely observe, of changing. Not fully, not once, and completely, the way it happened in stories. Slowly, incrementally. Through the hard daily work of a man who'd been forced to look at the shape of his own failures and had chosen, rather than defending them, to let them change him. She thought, that's the best anyone can do. Maybe it's enough. "You should go," she said. "The Eastern delegations arrived this afternoon." "I know." He didn't move for a moment. The Western Ridge Settlements, Vor's request for direct counsel representation. It's the right call, she said. You know it's the right call. I know. A pause. I'll sign it today. She nodded. He moved toward the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. You know, he said, not turning around, when you said no at the moon banquet, when the whole room went quiet, he stopped, paused. The specific silence of a man finding the shape of something he'd been carrying for a long time. I was angry. I was genuinely angry. I know. But I wasn't surprised, he said. Not really. Some part of me knew you'd say it. Some part of me had always known you'd say it eventually. He was quiet for a moment. I think some part of me needed you to. She looked at his back, at the set of his shoulders, the way he held himself in the doorway, the shape of a man who had been very large and very certain for a very long time and was learning, late, to be uncertain about the things that mattered. Darius, she said. He waited. Go sign the document, she said. He left. Mira appeared in the doorway a moment later, filling the space with the contained quiet that she always carried, the quality of someone who'd learned to exist at the edge of significant things without requiring acknowledgement for it. The delegations come in 3 hours, Mira said. I know. The Western Ridge report needs your signature before the session. I'll have it done. Mira looked at the clasp at her shoulder. Something moved through her face. Not sentiment, not Mira, but something near it. The compressed acknowledgement of a person who'd carried something difficult alongside you and was glad to still be standing. You look like yourself, Mira said. Serena considered that. She looked at the north-facing window of the small council room. Not her study window. This one faced a different direction, caught a different quality of light, morning rather than noon, gold rather than gray. It was not honest in the way the gray light was honest. It was warmer than that, more complicated. She thought about the woman who'd stood in the antechamber of the feast hall on the night of the moon banquet and straightened a silver clasp and decided, in the space of a single exhale, that she was done being afraid of her king. She thought about what that woman had known and what she hadn't known and how much both had cost her. She thought about everything that had happened since, not as a narrative with a shape, not as a story that had resolved into meaning, but as the actual texture of it. The cold cellar and the dried blood and the 3 hours of sleep in a chair and Tevra stepping aside in the dark and Rin's voice cutting through the chaos of the eclipse hall, clear and flat and absolutely certain. All those people who decided, at various points in the last few months, to stand in front of something rather than behind it. You don't build a kingdom alone, she thought. You build it out of the people who chose to believe in the version of it worth believing in. That's the only raw material there is. Go, Mira said. The document. Serena moved toward the door. At the threshold she paused. Not dramatically, not for effect. Simply the pause of a woman taking stock of a room before leaving it. The habit of someone who'd learned to notice where she'd been before moving toward where she was going. The small council room. The gold morning light. The chair where she'd pinned the clasp back onto her own shoulder. She looked at it for one moment. Then she walked out. The kingdom did not become simple. Kingdoms never did. The Northern Territories required 2 more years of careful diplomatic work before the agreements held cleanly. The Wolf Lord coalitions that had shifted during the conspiracy needed tending. Some of them came back naturally. Some needed time. Some never fully returned, which was honest and which she accepted. There were sessions in the council chamber that went badly and sessions that went well, and long weeks of exhausting logistics work that bore no resemblance to the compressed drama of what had started everything. She was present for all of it. Not as the king's Luna, not as his shadow, his instrument, his extension, as herself. As the woman who had said no in a quiet hall and set something irreversible in motion and had lived, uncomfortably and at great cost and with no guarantee of outcome, through every consequence that followed. The people of the Outer Territories, Vor's packs, the Western Ridge settlements, the communities that had stopped expecting anything from the capital and had been building their own versions of survival without it, started calling her something. Not a title, a name. The Luna of the people. She heard it first from one of Vor's riders, said in passing, the way you say something you assume everyone already knows. She heard it again in the Western Ridge settlement she visited in the spring, said by a woman older than anyone she'd met in the palace, said with the particular directness of someone who had no reason to perform anything for her. She didn't adopt it. She didn't reject it. She thought about what it meant, the shift from possessed to independent, from the king's Luna to the people's, from a title given to one earned in the specific fire of people deciding on their own what you were worth. She thought, that's the only kind of authority that lasts. Not the kind handed down, the kind built up from the ground, from 1,000 small choices made in the direction of something real, from the accumulated weight of showing up and telling the truth, and refusing, even when it would have been so much easier to kneel. The kingdom of Varellus went on, and at the center of it, in the council chamber with the gold morning light and the heavy table and the long work of building something worth defending, Serena Vale went on with it, not untouched, not unchanged, but standing, always still standing.